attending the meeting on Carroll Avenue last Wednesday night with about 30 residents and business owners. It was very helpful, and appreciate very much their ability to schedule on short notice and meet with residents who are concerned about various crimes taking place in the city. The second thing I wanted to just make note of is that the city is continuing to get some notice in press in various places around the country. Today I got another article from the New Port Richey, Florida paper, where the New Port Richey just became the third city in the country after Tacoma Park and West Hollywood to pass a resolution about cage-free chickens. So we led the way. There's now 2 others. It was also very gratifying that the COG Animal Services Committee had their awards ceremony, and I believe Councilmember Siemens made some remarks at those awards. And I was nominated and got an honorable mention for Elected Official of the Year for Animal Services. And that was for the action that this council took, so I just wanted to let you know that.
Congratulations.
And one other thing at the Council of Governments, I just wanted to share very briefly with my colleagues the list of the policy focus and priorities for COG for the coming year that we're going to be discussing at the board meeting on Wednesday. Just wanted to point out that COG in general will be focusing on their multi-year policy focus on growth and development. That's continuing for the 4th year in a row. New focuses for 2007 are regional housing continuum. They're going to look at a bunch of policy issues on housing, a regional focus on climate change, also looking at the upcoming census for 2010, and continuing with Metro dedicated funding, Chesapeake Bay, Anacostia restoration, and green building. So just wanted to let folks know that those are things that COG will be focusing on in the coming year. One final thing that's kind of COG related, I just wanted to let folks know that I went to the 88th annual midwinter networking dinner of the Board of Trade last week and met a couple of very interesting folks, one of whom is a city resident who is the executive director of the Greater Washington Initiative, which is an associated organization with the Board of Trade. And for my colleagues who might have missed it, I brought along the 2006 regional report for the Greater Washington Board of Trade. They focus on economic development in the region, and I figured that was a good resource to have somebody who knows all about regional economic development, and that we might call on that resident to assist us in some efforts that we might make around planning about any economic development that might take place in the city. There were also some other folks who I met who I've given contact information to staff, and they're going to be contacting for various other aspects of potential help with economic development. Any comments?
Sure. Did you mention the meeting at Jen Wofford's?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that my continuing attention is on the public safety issue, and that I was very pleased that the police chief made himself available last week to the residents all around the city, but it was held in Ward 3 at the home of Jen Wofford and Dan Seligman, and I appreciate his commitment to public safety in our area, in taking seriously a lot of the concerns that people have been expressing over the last 5 years but have not seen addressed yet. And I think he's off to a great start. He certainly has a lot of work to do to really get a handle on this, because as the meeting was wrapping up, there were 2 crimes, one on Carroll and one on Maple, people being robbed. So we certainly hope that they that our police department stays safe but also succeeds in getting on top of this. The other thing I wanted to say is just a hello to my recognizing my parents. They are here in town for the week, and want to greet them. Violet and Billy Austin are here from Orlando, so I'm very pleased to be enjoying time with them.
Anything else? Are there any additional agenda items? Okay, if we can move on to adoption of the minutes. Do I hear a motion?
I'd like to move the minutes for the...
Okay, I just have one comment on them. If I can make a friendly amendment, the minutes of February 12th on page 3, under item 1, I think there's the first paragraph in there is out of place and nonsensical and needs to be removed. So if the clerk agrees when she looks at that particular spot, then we could move them as amended. Okay. All those in favor of the minutes? For I was just going to get the dates in there. February 12th, February 20th, and February 26th, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the minutes carried. Public comment period for anybody who'd like to make any comments on items not on the regular meeting agenda.
My name's Patty Lovelace, 7620 Maple Avenue, Tacoma Park, Maryland. I want to ask the people, last week we were talking a lot about the Children First, and I'm wondering, would it be possible to carry that maybe as a celebration of Children First on the 4th of July parade, and have a delegation of the city's children leading the parade? I'm wondering, and maybe have that for the theme of the 4th of July parade, because I think that would be really great, you know, to actually have the parade led by our future leaders of our city, because eventually the children are going to be our city council and our mayors and our governor. And it would be great if we could do that, you know. I was wondering if anyone's ever thought about that. And also, if we could put out a notice to the schools to let them know that, you know, that the kids can come in here and learn about how our city government works and, you know, what goes on here, and maybe they'll be interested in teaching the other kids that in their citizenship classes or their social studies or whatever they call it now. Back when I was a kid, we called everything social studies. But it'd be great if we could do that. And also, again, to make the world a safer place for our children, on the 17th, which is coming up this Saturday, we are gathering at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial between, in the morning, and we're going to be marching around 12 o'clock to the Pentagon to protest the war in Iraq. Now, you heard that they want to send 7,000 more troops over there to have another surge on troops going over there. And again, those are the cream of our crop. Our youngsters are being sent over there. And I don't want another family to get the knock on the door and being told that their loved one is dead, or some little girl is never going to get a chance to kiss their father and mother goodnight because they were shot to death in the desert sands of Iraq or Iran. And I don't want to see that happen to any Iraqi families either, because we took the war too far. And if we can get as many people down there, anyone out there listening, we need as many people down there to help protest this war as possible and protest the killing and demand that we bring those troops home. And it'd be really great if we could do that. And also, what greater statement could we make for our children by having them lead our 4th of July parade, which is usually led around the country by military? Have our children lead it, and have our children lead the have a concert, say, at the fireworks event. You know, let it be Children First this year. Let that be the theme as we protest this war in Iraq and try to save the lives of the children that are going to come after us. That would be great if we could really do that. Is that possible to do that this year?
Pat, I thank you for the suggestion. As the Vice Chair of the Independence Day Committee, I'll bring that to the committee, and we're working right now to select the theme for the parade, so I will take that to them, and thank you for the suggestion.
Because Children's First would be one great way to show them that, you know, what this flag really stands for. It stands for everybody, the children as well, because they're eventually going to be our presidents. We're going to have to eventually answer to them. You know, so let's make the world a better place for them. And by coming out on the 17th of March and protesting this war, we need as many people as we can out there. There are people being killed every day over there. You know, and people getting maimed in the hospitals they have to come back to, and they're coming back brain damaged and stuff. And there's nothing worse than that, to come back brain damaged because of the war. Let's all stand up against this war. Let's be true Americans. Let's stand up what Tacoma Park really wants. Let's be true Tacoma Park citizens and march for peace and the future of our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Is there anyone else?
Seth Grimes, 7300 Willow Avenue. On the subject of public safety, it's worth mentioning that the Old Tacoma Business Association meeting tomorrow evening is going to be devoted to the subject of public safety in Old Tacoma, and I believe that Chief Rakucci will be there, as well as Commander Hilton Burton of the Metropolitan Police Department's 4th District, and I'll be there representing Safe Tacoma. That meeting starts at 7 p.m. at the Tacoma Masonic Building at the corner of Carroll and Maple. It's on the 3rd floor. There's a 6 p.m. networking session. I'm here tonight to raise a subject I brought up last week, which is Tacoma Park Living Wage Ordinance. The City Code calls for a formal procedure for a citizen like myself to request an item be added to the council agenda, and that is to submit a written letter to the mayor, which I've done. I'd like to read that letter and the list of signers. I recruited a few people beside myself. Dear Mayor Porter, living wage is a matter of right for all workers. We respectfully request that you schedule a council work session to discuss and craft a Tacoma Park Living Wage Ordinance modeled on Montgomery County's 2002 Living Wage Act and on State of Maryland legislation, House Bill 430. That's currently pending legislation. Enactment would create a mandate that all larger city contracts with for-profit and non-profit entities pay workers a wage that would place a family of 4 above the poverty line. Good intentions are not enough. We need a living wage built visibly and proudly into city law, a demonstration of good government that values economic justice. Sincerely, in the case where individuals are representatives of organizations, well, they're not here. Individuals are signing for themselves only. Sabrina Barron, Keith Berner, Lynn Bradley, Franca Brilliant, Mary Carter Williams, Karen Sapansky, Jose Dominguez. Jose is not a Tacoma Park resident, although he's involved with city activities. Same applies to 1 or 2 other people. Mark Elrich, Gail Fisher-Stewart, Tom Gagliardo, Norm Gleichman, Pastor Mark Greiner, who is the new pastor of the Tacoma Park Presbyterian Church, myself, Seth Grimes, Stacy Gurian-Sherman, Tom Hucker, Jane Hurst, Sachivan Iklay Khalsa, Jason Judd, Marty Idner, Robert Lanza, George Leventhal, Heather Mizier, Hank Prensky, Marie Rizzo, Jamie Raskin, Mary Robnet, Mary Rooker, Larry Rubin, Fran Tall, Cindy Terrell, Mike Tidwell, Gustavo Torres, who is not a resident, I don't believe, but is the head of CASA of Maryland, Catherine Tunis, Lois Wessel, and Kevin Zeese. The name Mary Rooker is omitted from this printed version because it came in late. I don't have anything to add to this by way of advocacy. I do want to relate that several of the people whom you know expressed a willingness, even an eagerness in some cases, to come participate in a city council work session to actually craft the bill. The letter mentions a poverty level. Tom Hucker suggested subsequent to the first circulation of this letter that the proper basis for a living wage in Tacoma Park should not be the poverty level, but rather should be the food stamp eligibility level. So I would ask you to take that into consideration. In any case, I hope, Mayor Porter, that you will schedule this soon. I will give copies of the letter to the city clerk, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address them. Otherwise, I'll sit down.
Thank you, Seth. As I said in our email exchange, I am supportive of a living wage proposal. However, I think before the council takes it up, we need to get some additional information on the impact that it would have on the city budget, city operations, and so I think we need to have that information before we move forward on that.
Mayor Porter, I would like, when we get the information, to include not just contractors with the city, but also city employees in the information so that we can see what the impact would be and whether, in fact, we need to make a change to require a living wage for city employees and for the casual labor that we use.
Yes, that's a good idea.
Of course, we all understand that when the council considers resolutions and ordinances, that they ask the staff to prepare a fiscal impact statement, and it's foreseen that this evaluation would be part of the process. I can't see that waiting on an evaluation would be part of, would it be an impediment to scheduling a work session? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Good evening. My name is Mark Hessel. I'm not here as a partisan for the first part of my comments tonight. 3 weeks ago, when the agenda item on amending Section 6.28.010 came up, that's the notice to purchasers that Tacoma Park has rent control, I had a brief conversation with Ken, and I thought that there really ought to be some teeth in this, because the guy who may be hurt the most is the one who doesn't find out until after settlement, when he's already bought the place, that he hasn't bought what he thought he was buying because of Tacoma Park's rent control laws. But I'm also a settlement attorney, and whenever I see a statute that says after settlement you can still rescind the deal, big bells and whistles go off. I'll give you an example. If I have an 8-unit building that sells for, let's say, $1 million, and a mortgage of $750,000 on it, and it gets sold, and the mortgage gets paid off, and the new mortgage company is there, and they've laid out maybe $800,000 or so as a mortgage, and then 1, 2, maybe 3 years later, somebody files suit to rescind the whole deal. Well, you've already had all this money laid out. How are you going to undo the deal after it's already been handled and the old mortgage is paid off? I like the idea of putting real teeth in this. I think that the title insurance industry is going to go through the roof. Not that you necessarily need to cater to them, but you need to make sure that properties in Tacoma Park are sellable. I think maybe a little more, I don't know what the solution is either. I'm really not being an advocate here, but I think maybe you need to give a little bit more thought to exactly how this works and talk to some people in the business of buying and selling properties before you go allowing purchasers to rescind 1, 2, 3 years after a deal has already been made. Maybe there's some other teeth that you can put in it. That is my comment on that. My comments on the other items, new Councilmember Snipper accepted, perhaps. Everybody's heard most of my comments. I won't go into great depth, but I will urge the council once again, look at the economics of being a landlord in Tacoma Park. If a landlord cannot, really look at the expenses and the income that's allowed. And if a landlord cannot make enough money to make it a reasonable investment, then rental housing becomes a non-viable business in Tacoma Park, and eventually it will collapse with a huge thud. Thank you.
Mr. Hessel, the current version of the law that we're looking at on notification says that they could rescind the contract of sale within 5 days following the receipt of the notice.
Right, but they may not receive the notice even at the time of settlement. I've got a case like this.
Okay, so all right, now I understand what you're saying. So you're saying that if they don't receive the notice of settlement ever, okay, I understand what you're saying.
There's a new law, relatively new, about a 1.5-year old law on the books dealing with foreclosure consulting contracts and foreclosure reconveyances, which allows, it's in the Real Property article, I think it's Title 7, but I could check. It allows you to rescind even after settlement. And I've got a case right now where a $500,000 mortgage was paid off, all kinds of other money was dispersed. My client never got a written notice she was allowed to get. She was the seller. And we sent a letter saying we rescind. And now the whole thing is way up in the air. Absolute nightmare.
Okay, I do understand your
That's my
point now.
point.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Peter Aaron, and I live at 7212 Willow Avenue, and I own a 9-unit apartment building on Carroll Avenue. I just want to say I understand that you are going to consider tonight adjusting the annual rent stabilization amount. And although maybe you've heard this before, I just want to call to your attention that since 9/11, for example, my insurance rates have tripled. That any of you who pay electricity know that rise last summer in electric rates was astronomical. My tenants pay their own electric charges, but I pay for air conditioning for everybody in the building. And from May through October, I've never seen bills like that before. Similarly with natural gas, when they spiked 2 years ago, taxes are going way higher than the consumer price index, and even garbage collection. So I would just say that I would just urge you to consider that I am trying to keep a really nice building, and I've got a bunch of tenants, a really good bunch of tenants, but it is becoming increasingly impossible with rent control and with the costs that I have to bear on behalf of my building to make it work. So when you consider how to adjust this, I would ask you to keep that in mind, because I can't make this building work with those sorts of increases and with just a minimal increase in the annual rent stabilization amount. I wish I could, because I don't mind doing what I'm doing, but I just can't make it work. So I urge you to keep that in, take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak at this point?
I wanted to, I made a council comment and just wanted to add that in case other council members don't know, I'm attending the National League of Cities conference, which is going on today and tomorrow and a little bit on Wednesday. We enjoyed hearing from Steny Hoyer this morning, and tomorrow Hillary Clinton will be there, as well as Chris Dodd and George Stephanopoulos. So it's certainly interesting hearing these national figures' perspectives on what we at the local level know well, and hearing their commitment to working with us and helping us achieve our goals.
Since Councilmember Austin Lane has taken the opportunity to make a late council comment, I think I will do the same also. Apologies for not being here at the beginning of the meeting, but I wanted to let everyone, including the members of the council, know that we will not be having a council meeting the first week in April. There are 5 Mondays in April, and so we will be having council meetings the 4th through the 5th month. I'm sorry, the 2nd through the 5th Mondays instead of the 1st through the 4th Mondays. We did this because the first Monday in April is the first night of Passover. Passover extends for several nights that week, and rather than attempting to find a time that was both clear of people's Passover plans and clear of their other scheduling, we decided to simply cancel the council meeting that week. Since there are 4 Mondays remaining in April, that will not eliminate the 4 Monday meetings in April. But I wanted to make sure that everybody who is listening to us and everyone on the council had that information. All right, the next item on the agenda is the city manager's updates.
Just a few quick items this evening. I wanted to let the council know that Benita George and I will be meeting with representatives of James F. Knott, as well as the project architect this Wednesday, to continue our efforts to try and resolve all outstanding issues related to Phase 1. Work on the elevator and other punch list items are ongoing with TRG Construction, who is the contractor for Phase 2. The last item I had relative to any community center matters is to note that the bond bill hearing took place in Annapolis this past Saturday. On behalf of the staff, I'd like to express my appreciation to Mayor Porter and Councilmember Clay, who were in attendance and helped with the city's presentation, and also Suzanne Ludlow, who did her usual creative job This year's theme was the top 10 reasons why the legislature should support a bond bill for the gym. Kind of our takeoff on David Letterman, and I think Suzanne and Colleen Clay, I think, were the major presenters, correct? The last item unrelated to the community center is just to note that there will be a joint meeting of the Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee and the City Council this Wednesday at 6:30. Earlier this evening, the city clerk did provide the City Council with a copy of the agenda for Wednesday's meeting. That concludes my report, unless the council has questions about any item.
Are there any questions?
I'd love an update on the elevator.
Nothing has really changed since last week, Councilman Broston Lane. We are basically, TRG has had, I think, 1 or 2 inspections done at this point. They're just going through the permitting process. And that's obviously, the scheduling of that is somewhat outside of their control. But we're hopeful it'll be done by the end of this month.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, we'll move along to the first item on our regular meeting agenda, which is a ordinance concerning a contract for installation of a rain garden and trench drain on Cleveland Avenue. Whatever you want.
Okay. Happy to have these 2 items, both this one and the next one, in front of you. We've gone through a bid process to award a contract for adding information to our GIS database specific to stormwater. We solicited proposals far and wide, got 3 responses back. We have worked with KCI Technologies.
Are you going to do the GIS update? Or
Oh,
are you
yeah,
gonna do
which one?
This
Cleveland Avenue's first.
Cleveland Avenue.
Cleveland Avenue's first. Excuse
It must be a long
I
day.
said it was a long day. Well, anyway, even happier to talk about Cleveland Avenue. This is a project that's been on the planning boards for some time, and the folks on Cleveland Avenue have been waiting quite a while for the city to address both a street restoration project there. As soon as the engineer went and took a look at Cleveland Avenue, probably more than 2 years ago, he determined that there were significant stormwater issues that had to be resolved prior to resurfacing the road. He has developed a comprehensive and innovative program. It'll be the first of its kind, in a way, in Tacoma Park. I'm excited that the stormwater program is embracing and moving forward on these kind of innovative technologies. The options here, there weren't really very many of them, but the traditional option would have been to build a big stormwater pipe from the end of Cleveland Avenue, which is a dead end, run it down the hill, and join it to a even larger stormwater pipe running along Piney Branch Road, basically taking all the surface water and the pollutants and everything that runs down Cleveland Avenue currently and sits in a couple of private property lots, and channeling it, piping it, and dumping it into the stormwater system and eventually into Sligo Creek. What this proposed program will do is actually allow quite a bit of water infiltration into the ground on Cleveland Avenue, address some of the erosion and standing water problems at the foot of Cleveland Avenue, and get us away from the traditional bricks and mortar or pipe systems and into a more environmentally sensitive approach for managing stormwater. We've had the pleasure of working with Natural Resources Design as the firm that the city has hired to do the design on this. They've met with the people on Cleveland Avenue through several different meetings as a group, and also through specific meetings with the individuals whose 2 properties are most affected by the stormwater on Cleveland Avenue. So we've had to break the project into 3 phases. This will be the first phase. This will actually establish 2 rain gardens at the base of Cleveland Avenue and a trench drain that will serve as sort of the holding areas for the water that now currently rushes down the street after a storm and sort of floods out the front lawns of these 2 properties. There will be a system in place to deal with high water and overflow water. There will be a pipe and riprap system that will address some of the high water issues. But this will be the first stage in getting that project addressed. The second 2 stages will probably be coming to you in the budget with requesting additional funds, primarily for the complementary system for this, which is along the sides of the road. What the engineer and the designers have developed is a sort of water retention system that will run sort of in place of gutters. It'll actually be underground retention basins that run along the side of the road. So again, capturing the water that's now currently flushing down Cleveland Avenue, capturing in these underground retention basins, allowing the trees, which are numerous in the street. If you've ever been on Cleveland Avenue, there are massive, huge trees there. Allow those trees to have access to that water. Those trenches will be connected to the bottom trench drain in the rain garden, so eventually all this water, if it's of a capacity beyond the retention basins itself, will end up flowing down to the base of the street. But what we're talking about tonight is just phase one, which is you got to have the rain garden established and the trench drain at the bottom of the street before any of the rest of it takes place. Again, as we're moving ahead into alternative modes, it was very challenging to identify contractors who were willing to bid on this project. I think that it'll get easier in the future as they get familiar with and we get familiar with these different techniques. But the contractor who was low bid is very responsible and resourceful and is kind of entering into this collaborative process with the city to establish this proposal.
Are there any?
I just wanted to say a couple of things. This is, in North Tacoma, it seems that they are on the cutting edge all the time. They had the first speed table in Tacoma Park. Now they're going to have one of the first rain gardens that we've set up. So I'm excited to see this go forward. I want to thank you, Daryl, for working so closely with the neighbors and making sure that this was something that they could accept and even celebrate. And it does look like this is the right proposal. I'm hoping that it's within the budget that you had set out for this. And I think it looks very good. It does sound like it was a challenge to get the bids, and I appreciate you getting 3 so that we can make sure that we're comparing apples to apples and looking at the range of expenses here.
Yeah, I just want to get a sense of the next 2 phases, whether they're shifted into 08 purely on the timing of the project, whether it's the timing at the end of the, timing for the work or timing in the budget cycle that's getting to the end of the available funds for this year and it goes to next year, or whether the amount of money for those is of a size that requires going there, and if you have any sense of the size of it.
Yeah, the first of these 3 phases, this first phase will clearly fit within the budget that we had originally envisioned for this project. I think it was a $30,000 or $35,000 is what we were anticipating. The second phase, which is the trench drains to run parallel along portions of the street, that project we didn't anticipate, we don't have funds for. We would need to approach it in FY08. The third phase of the project is the resurfacing of the streets, and we intend to do that with the capital budget. The street restoration funds that are currently allocated each year, and we have it on the schedule for FY08. One of those will work in 07 and is already funded. One of those we'd already anticipated in 08. Phase 2 is the unanticipated expenditure that we'll be asking for out of the stormwater budget for next year.
Any sense of?
Sense of cost, the city engineer probably knows, and I don't. We haven't bid it out yet. I know we have estimates based on what the anticipated expense is, but again, we're in kind of unfamiliar territory for many contractors.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I just wanted to make sure that, I think this is great, innovative, and it keeps the surface water from running off rapidly, and that's one of the issues environmentally. But I want to make sure that we are not creating a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Maybe you could address that?
Sure. The whole physiology of rain gardens, I guess, as you might call it, my understanding of the purpose of a rain garden is to basically provide a retention area with no longer life than about 24 hours. Within 24 hours, the water in a rain garden should draw down. You need more days of wet for that, for mosquito breeding, so it's not anticipated as increasing any mosquito breeding as a result of the rain garden itself.
And what about in the channels that you were describing along?
The retention basins, they'll act similarly. They are underground. They don't have access to above-ground water. Will percolate through a layer of gravel and eco-pavers, so the access points just won't be there for mosquito larvae.
Not like storm sewer.
Right, right. Yeah, you won't have any open channels. It'll be through a filtration medium that the water comes down through.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions, Stephen?
I had a question concerning how the, because I noticed that the trenches would run along the side of the road. Is there any issue with water getting under the pavement? How are the I don't really quite understand how the trenches are constructed.
Well, there could be if they weren't designed well. There is going to be a membrane that separates the, I guess if you're, for lack of a better definition, of a profile of the street. If you were to chop the street in half, and you have your base layer of asphalt and your surface layer of asphalt, yeah, water, if it wasn't contained or controlled, could go under that and cause problems with your street layer. My understanding of the way these trenches are created, first of all, you have permeability within the trench itself, so water's going to tend to flow where it's easiest to flow and not back through an area when there's an easier and more available route for it to go. But there's also some kind of liner system that coats the trench on the street side, not on the ground side, because the idea, of course, is for the water to percolate out to the sides. That my understanding the location of these, they're either going to be 2 or 4 feet wide, I can't remember now, but there'll be the sidewalk, which currently exists on Cleveland Avenue, and then they have sort of a swale curb. They don't really have a curb there. It would be within that area that the access point for the trenches will come down the road. And they won't be from beginning to end of the street. There is a tree that's in the right-of-way, and there's some utility issues, so they're going to be worked out through portions of the street. It won't be the entire length of the street.
Are there other questions? It's been moved. Does someone want to second it?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. I want to thank you, Daryl, for bringing this forward. I think it's a very innovative idea and a direction that we have wanted to move for some time in terms of stormwater. And I hope that what we learn in terms of doing this and in terms of its operation will be helpful and enable us to expand this idea to other places in the city. So I really want to thank you for bringing it forward.
Sure.
Are there any additional council comments? Are there any public comments on this ordinance?
Yeah, this is Mr. Lovelace again, 7620 Maple Avenue. I got one question about that. Is that going to cause any problem with the ice, causing frost heaves in the pavement later on?
My understanding, the way it's designed, it shouldn't add to any frost heave situations. The water itself won't be sitting. It'll be flowing. It'll be percolating. And I can get more specific information from the city engineer, but my understanding is heaves usually happen with water within the first few layers of soil. Yeah. And this will be far below that, 18 to 2 feet down below the surface.
We've been getting a lot more cold weather at night and stuff, and the water tends to freeze real fast. I was wondering if you guys taking that into consideration.
Yeah, most of this will be happening, like I say, 18 to 24 inches below the surface. And my understanding is that the access point to freezing on the surface is not going to be as much of an issue.
Okay. Just wanted to make you aware of that.
Any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none. This is a single reading ordinance, so will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter?
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane? Aye. Councilmember Barry? Councilmember Clay?
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens?
Aye.
Councilmember Sniffer?
Aye.
Councilmember Williams?
Aye.
This single reading ordinance passes. Now you're on your GIS system.
Okay. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the residents of Cleveland Avenue for the past ordinance, because without their openness and understanding the process, we couldn't have gone forward. We always come up with good ideas, but selling them to folks is a different matter. So they were ready to sign on and ready to, and they weren't an easy sell either. They really required explanations and thorough review. So kudos to the residents that allowed the alternative option to be presented. This next one is really a much more simple matter. In the budget for this year, we came to you with a request for increased funding for our GIS update as part of the database that we need to do to meet the requirements of the Clean Water Act and the NPDES permits, basically making sure that our system is operating as efficiently as possible and beginning the process of identifying potential water quality issues. So through this next proposal, we'd like to award a contract to KCI Technologies for primarily two main functions. One is to survey all our existing structures within the city, those that we already know about or think we know about and have on our maps, which actually the last date that we have for a database is 1988, so we're working off of 1988 data. As we find with our cleaning contract, sometimes the inlets and the lines that we think are there are not there, or they're actually in different locations than we have them on our map. So what we'll be able to do through this contract is the vendor will be using GIS technology and will be citing our structures with a GIS coordinate, and that information can be downloaded to our existing GIS layer. So we will actually locate, rather than hypothetically or theoretically, our stormwater lines. They're actually going to be actually located on our GIS system. It'll be a real revolution for us in terms of taking a huge step forward in understanding our system for a number of reasons. First and foremost, of course, is to really identify and locate where the pipes are and where the pipes go. Every once in a while, we'll have a collapse of a pipe, and it'll be one nobody knew about. Or we'll be looking for a pipe, and we can't find it because some construction happened and something was moved and it just didn't get updated. So this will actually enable us to really have a good handle on our system. When they're out there locating the structure with the GIS, they'll also be reviewing and providing us perfunctory data about that. How big is the pipe? How deep is the inlet? What kind of pipe? Is it concrete, clay, whatever? So again, we have some of that information already in the system, but this will be a second run through making sure that the information we have is correct. The other thing that we're going to be doing through this contract is the first next phase of NPDES, which is water quality testing. So at our outfalls, while they're locating the structures and identifying the structures, defining them for us, they'll also be pulling water samples that will then be tested for the cursory run of things that the NPDES rules require. I mean, stuff as simple as pH and turbidity, and also a little bit of chemical analysis. It's very cursory at this point. It's not into detail. It will give us a few hits along a scale of water quality testing. From that, we'll be able to see kind of broad brush, do we have any outfalls where there's some significant concerns, some pH concerns, some turbidity concerns, or some other elemental testing concerns. And then we can focus our resources in the future towards them if we've identified them. But it basically will enable us to take that first run through testing our outfalls. The other thing it'll be able to do is, because we'll be downloading all this information into our GIS system, we think we know now where pipes go and how the water flows and where our flood-prone areas are, but it'll really further enhance that knowledge, and we'll be able to understand from a topographic relationship how our system functions. So there may be some new insights and new information that we'll be gaining as these data points are identified and entered. So again, as I was saying before, KCI is a company that did some refining of our GIS system, basically in preparation for this phase. So they're familiar with the information and gave us an excellent price on the project. You can see there, comparative to the other companies that we spoke with, their price was significantly lower. That raised some concerns on the part of staff, so they brought them in and had them do a presentation in front of the folks that use GIS within the city arborist, the planners, myself, as well as the engineer, and basically made them sort of run through, was their offer really as good as it sounded on paper? And we were all convinced at the end of that meeting that we think we'll get a really fine product at the end of this, and really are ready to go ahead with this next step. they are doing, KCI is doing this same kind of structure analysis and testing for counties throughout the state, Anne Arundel County, Montgomery County, through the state highway system. So they've developed their technology, they developed their process for doing it. They think they'll be in and out of the city identifying all our information within 4 weeks, so it's going to be a fairly quick grasping of information and then downloading it. So we'll be able to see where we are very quickly.
Thank you. Speaking of long days, I neglected to ask the council to convene itself into the Stormwater Management Board before we took that last vote. We are probably legal, but just to ensure that we are, I think we should just take the vote again. So first of all, does someone want to move that we convene as the Stormwater Management Board? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, this council is now sitting as the council and as the Stormwater Management Board, which we are required to do in order to expend funds from the Stormwater Management budget. All right, and I'm going to ask the city clerk, just to make sure that we're completely legal, to redo the previous vote. Now, I'm asking the council to vote again on the previous item. I believe that, why don't you go ahead and move it again?
Okay, I'd like to move the single reading ordinance for the installation of 2 rain gardens in Cleveland Avenue.
And you're going to second it again? Okay. All right. Now, will the clerk do the vote again, and then we will resume with the GIS one.
Mayor Porter?
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane? Aye. Councilmember Barry? Councilmember Clay? Aye. Councilmember Siemens?
Aye.
Councilmember Snipper?
Aye.
Councilmember Williams?
Aye.
Thank you. Now, does the council have any questions on the GIS database update ordinance?
I was going to move it.
Okay, Bruce wants to move it.
Second.
Okay, it's been seconded. Okay.
Are they using a GPS system to locate these things?
Yeah, when they're out in the field doing the field work, they will log it. They have a great system of a laptop and whatever that thing is called on site, so they'll be able to download information about the structure right into the system, and then they can send that information over to our system.
Yeah, I've seen people doing this. It's pretty amazing.
It's got my mind whirling with all the things we could do.
Okay, are there any other questions, Terry?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Porter. Yeah, I think mapping of the infrastructure of the city has a lot of advantages. Certainly the stormwater is an important one in the city of Tacoma Park. My question is, though, that my county taxes have paid for the GIS mapping in the county. Are we being rebated for this contract?
No, we use the county's GIS system, so our basic main layer of information comes from the county through park and planning. So in that way, we are using their building blocks to input our specific information.
Okay, maybe I didn't make myself clear. A couple weeks ago, I asked about the telephone poles because I know that the county has mapped the telephone or power poles or is mapping them in the county, but not inside municipalities. When you look at the GIS information that the county has online across the internet, when you get to the Tacoma Park border, there are no telephone poles within the city of Tacoma Park that are mapped. I understand that the county was mapping all stormwater entrances, storm sewers, and pipelines and things such as that. Have they included Tacoma Park in that mapping?
Not to my knowledge. I know that State Highway has done it in Montgomery County. I'm not aware of how much else that has been done through county government.
They had a GIS project that was allegedly mapping all of the infrastructure items in the county. I know that Bruce Romer was heading up that project. It seems like we should be included in that, or we should be rebated for that if we have to do that work ourselves in the city of Tacoma Park.
I don't know the details because we haven't looked in it, but that would be a question since we pay with our stormwater based on our stormwater utility fee and don't theoretically pay the county for stormwater management. That could be the explanation there, but I don't know the full range of details about it.
Ms. Matthews, I think I still have a question into you about the power poles, telephone poles. that they have not been mapped in Tacoma Park, and I was wondering if you've gotten an answer back on that yet.
No, I have not, Councilmember Siemens.
Okay. And maybe you could clarify for us on the stormwater, it would help. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Are there any public comments on this ordinance? All right, seeing none, this is also a single reading ordinance, so will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter?
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane? Aye. Councilmember Barry? Councilmember Clay?
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens?
Aye.
Councilmember Sniffer?
Aye.
Councilmember Williams?
Aye.
That ordinance also passes. The next item on the agenda, thank you, Darrell, I very much appreciate it. The next item on the agenda is the second reading of the ordinance that would expand the notification requirements for selling a rental facility.
As the mayor has noted, this is the second reading of a two-reading ordinance which would amend the notification requirements currently included in the code regarding the sale or transfer of rental properties. As previously discussed, there'd be a formal notification as a requirement of this ordinance, which would require sellers to give prospective purchasers a formal notice regarding the various rental laws in Tacoma Park, including rent stabilization, rental housing licensing, tenant opportunity to purchase, etc. Since the first reading, we have amended the notice to include language requested by Councilmember Siemens. And if you turn to the page 6 of 7 of the actual ordinance, you'll note the, page 5 of 7. In the language that will be included in the notice of rental housing laws, it indicates that the City of Tacoma Park strongly encourages prospective purchasers to familiarize themselves with local laws. We have also, at staff's initiation, recognized that not all properties are subject to rent stabilization and provided for a certificate of exemption. That would be the case where there is a single-family house or another unit or property that is rented, but for whatever reason is not subject to rent stabilization. They would have to include that certificate of exemption that would be issued by the city in those situations.
I wonder, and I assume I would address this to Ken, if you have any thoughts regarding Mr. Hessel's comment about the issue of undoing settlement, undoing the legal things that were enacted at settlement.
I do. I think he's right that certainly would be problematic for all involved if somebody tried to rescind after settlement. But the purpose of the provision is to encourage landlords to comply with the law prior to settlement. So they're ignoring the law at their own risk. Now, whether this ordinance is going to be effective for the purchaser in enforcing their rights and getting out of the contract, I'm not sure. It's not something that the city is going to prosecute on behalf of the purchasers, but it is going to facilitate any legal claims that they might have.
I was just going to say, am I understanding then that your advice to us is that it's important to have some kind of enforcement provision, and that you still believe, in spite of that concern, that this is the best enforcement provision? Am I understanding that?
I think that the things we could do via municipal infractions are probably not going to be enough on their own to ensure compliance, because we're talking about potentially large amounts of money at stake in the sale of a property. So I think this is probably the best way we have to for there to be some real repercussions from violating it.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm not an expert on real estate law and settlements and all of those transactions, but I do remember in the experiences my family and I have had that once you put a contract or bid on a house, then that contract has to go through certain checkpoints before it's ratified, and then settlement is scheduled and takes place. I would think that it would be an enforcement mechanism enough to add it as a contingency before settlement. I'm not sure exactly how you put that in place, but if it's motivation for the landlord or for the seller that you want, then making it kind of a barrier to settlement, something that could keep a contract from going to settlement, in my view, would be incentive enough. It wouldn't need to be the kind of thing where you'd rescind it after settlement. But as I said, I'm not an expert, and I don't know exactly the right change.
I think the problem is that if a landlord ignores the law, then the tenant may never realize that the purchaser will never realize that they had, they didn't receive the notice, and they'll go to settlement. And
right. It would, in my view, if someone got into a contract and they were looking for a way to get out, if the landlord had not informed them or the seller had not informed them of this, and I'm assuming there's some signature necessary to certify that they had been informed, then it would be a way for them to get out of the contract. I would think that would motivate the seller enough to notify them. You wouldn't have to do this rescinding after settlement thing for them to be incentivized.
Go ahead. Did you have a comment on that? Or another comment?
I had a comment on that.
Terry, go ahead.
I think it's a timing issue, as I understand it. And the purchaser may not realize, may not learn if he's not advised, he or she is not advised that we have the rent stabilization laws and has not been provided with the proper information. It may be after settlement that, before the purchaser makes an application to or tries to raise the rent, people object, come to the city, and then the city says, oh, no, you can't do that because of rent stabilization laws. And then if we didn't have this provision in there, it would be too late for the purchaser to take action. So I think we need to have this clause in there.
Right, that's the thinking behind it.
But I think the crucial point is that what we need to do is to make sure that settlement doesn't happen without that notice having been provided, because once settlement happens, it's too late in practical terms. So do we know what the is there a procedure where something like this kind of gets inserted into the process for settlement attorneys in Montgomery County who know that anybody selling a multifamily property in the city of Tacoma Park, that there's this requirement and it needs to be on their checklist for settlement, and they go through settlement and they go, have you done this? Yes, no. If it's no, kick the settlement.
That's our intent after presuming adoption of the ordinance. We'll be distributing the information to various title companies in the area, as well as meeting with the Greater Washington Realtors Association and distributing it to the local realtors.
Do we know if there's if this is one of a number of things that they have as a checklist for settlements? Is that the way business operates?
It's my understanding that the Realtors Association has something they call a forms committee, which puts together the documents that need to be included in closings. Whether everyone uses it or not, I can't guarantee that, but that's something that the realtors who belong to that particular association follow. And that's based on conversations I've had with a couple of realtors in the area in terms of what is the best way to get this information out. So basically, if this ordinance is adopted, this information will be provided to that forms committee or that rules committee, who would then look at it and incorporate it within the documents that they have.
Do we know if there are settlement attorneys who don't follow the forms committee, the list?
I don't know whether they all do.
Maybe we can get a comment from Mr. Hessel.
I have a settlement company.
You have to come to the microphone.
I have a real estate settlement company. We do 200 or 300 settlements a year. Most of it, though, is residential. A few of them are commercial. The way to get to settlement attorneys is through their title insurance companies. There are about probably 4 to 6 title insurance companies that control probably 80-90% of the title insurance in Maryland. And I can't recall it offhand, but I'm pretty sure there's an association of them. The title insurance companies are the ones who can take the hits on this if something goes bad. So you want to contact First American, Talon, Chicago, Lawyers Title, Stewart, Conestoga. There are a few others. That's one way to reach the settlement attorneys. Something will slip through, though. I think one thing that's important to recognize is, I'm not certain about this, but I would suspect that most of the people who run into this problem, where they're buying a rental property and they don't realize there's rent control, are buying the smaller units, smaller buildings, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. Maybe there's something to do in there. Maybe you could say something like, you sell it without giving the notice. It's a violation for each day after settlement that you don't give the notice. You can run up a decent fine on that. And the people who need to be told about that are the current landlords, and you do have their names and numbers. So there are probably other things you can do. But blowing up the whole deal after the fact, I mean, if a client came to me.
But didn't you say that's the way to get to the title insurance company?
Is through their the way to get to the settlement attorneys is through the title insurance companies. They'll put out a
But the way to get the title insurance company's attention is the way we have it crafted.
Well, that may be, but if something falls through the cracks, I mean, you're right about that, absolutely. But when something falls through the cracks, if somebody comes to me and says, I bought this building, what a mistake, I'll say, a year from now, I might say, did you get a notice that, rent control applied in Tacoma Park? And if they say no, I could advise the client, walk away from the property now. We'll file suit on Tuesday. And then you don't have anybody managing the property. The seller maybe is retired to Florida or is God knows where. The purchaser, current owner, is going to go into court for an order saying this deal is rescinded. Let the chips fall where they may. You're right. Creating that kind of chaos is what will help get the title insurance company's attention. There could still be stuff that falls through the cracks. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. It's a knotty problem.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that. How do we go about now enforcing the tenant's right of first refusal?
Yeah.
Because that's something.
Sometimes in arrears.
Well, yeah, that's the point that I wanted to make. Yeah.
Tenant opportunity to purchase law becomes a factor when there are tenants that are in occupancy in the
Right.
unit. When they're not in the unit, then there isn't any obligation.
Right,
If someone
right. I understand that, though, but I mean, I know of instances where a sale was going forward and we had to stop it or retrieve it, and at least one can't.
I know of one where they were making renovations to the building, and it had been made before it was reversed.
Right.
What usually happens is if the property is for sale, then we may get a call from a real estate agent or from the owner saying, what do I need to do to sell my property? They would give us a notification, a copy of the notice that they sent to the tenants in regard to the opportunity to purchase. If they fail to do that, oftentimes we get tenants who come into the office who will notify us, this is the notice we've received, and that will prompt us to get in touch with the owner or real estate agent
Even after the sale has happened?
No, this is at the beginning process, so we would advise them, you didn't follow the law, you need to give the tenants the right to purchase. And usually when they contact us, they do pull back and abide by the code. I asked for a copy of the contract because on the contract is the name of the prospective purchaser. And if it's not clear or if it's not stated, I'll call the real estate broker or the seller to find out the name and the address of the prospective purchaser, so I can send them a letter advising them about the laws. We have in Tacoma Park and to contact us or to come into the office to view the rent report.
Yeah.
That's our only means right now.
It seems to me that this is exactly the same situation, and that since we have to go through that in order to enforce the tenant's opportunity to purchase, then adding this on isn't going to create any more of a problem, because presumably, if you were notified that by the tenants that they weren't given their opportunity to purchase, that gives you the opportunity to say, by the way, have you been getting all this info? Do you know about this requirement for notice and all that sort of thing? And also, if you got the requirements that the notice hadn't been provided, there's going to be a problem with the tenant's opportunity to purchase. It seems to me these two things are going to be, you're going to have the same risks from both of them. So I don't know that we're adding to anything.
We had been in touch with the real estate association and asked them if they would, just voluntarily include the notification about rent stabilization. They said that we would have to legislate it. So.
Right. Well, and so we were doing, Colleen.
We have a case right now where we had a building that got sold, and then we have the new owner, and in the end, we worked it out with the new owner to give the tenants the opportunity to purchase, isn't that right?
Actually, there have been two of them in the last 4 years, I believe. One was over in Manor Circle, and is it Manor Circle?
The Manor Circle thing was a little different, because that was,
you don't want to get into that.
Recently over on
Right.
Ethan Allen.
But what happened, instead of actually reversing the sale and going backwards through the process, is that they came up with a settlement. And I suspect that if somebody managed to get all the way through a purchase and then find that their unit that they bought, and like Mr. Hessel said, I think you're going to be talking about smaller buildings, is now worth $200,000 less or something, that I think it's less likely that the deal is going to actually go backwards and that they're going to come up with some kind of a settlement agreement. But I would have to agree in this particular instance that if there isn't some drastic clause at the other end of the process, that then if you get all the way through the process and you didn't have to give up the information and the thing got sold, you get away scot-free. Mm-hmm. And it's big, it's scary, but that'll get people to put out the information that they, in all honesty, should be putting out now without us having to go through this process. But so I think it's just what it takes to get people to put out the information.
I had a question about, isn't there responsibility of the real estate agents and so on to make known information they have about the property? If a freeway were going to be planned to go right through it and things like that, aren't they required to do that?
I think that that this law will help put an obligation on real estate agents to address rent control. Certainly, even the buyer's agent should be helping them to understand the laws of the city, but it'll also put the sellers on notice of this issue. I don't know the precisely the requirements of real estate agents. What they must disclose. Certainly they can't misrepresent things, but I'm not sure what affirmative obligations they have regarding applicable laws.
Are there additional questions? Or would someone like to move this at second reading?
I'll move it.
Okay, it is moved and seconded at second reading. So we're going forward with, and I will make the assumption that the mover and seconder moved and seconded it with the language which is in front of us now in it. Is that correct?
Certainly.
Yes.
Okay, that's the way it's moved and seconded. Is there any additional council comments or questions? Is there any public comments on this ordinance at second reading? All right, seeing none.
I have a question, I guess. I'm not convinced that enforcement of this is possible, and what it seems like you're advising us that the city should put this in place with the existing language, because that's the only way for it to have teeth. But then what will our obligation be to pursue cases where people violate this?
Well, I mean, any violation of the city code can be prosecuted as a municipal infraction.
But you said the city wouldn't go about attempting prosecutions on this one.
No, what I mean is the city wouldn't, I don't think we would, litigate the set-aside transactions. That would be the responsibility of the purchaser.
I think the teeth is it gives the purchaser an ability that the seller would not want to, it gives the purchaser something that the seller would not want to have them have. So they would have an incentive to actually give them the information, to give them the notice, the information on rent stabilization, rather than run the risk that the purchaser finds out later and then has the ability to rescind the contract. Although I would agree with Colleen, I think at that point, rather than rescinding the contract, I think there would be some kind of a settlement made. But it still could end up costing the seller something. So I think they would have an incentive to do it.
I do have a process question of the Housing Department. Does the Housing Department give some kind of regular notice to tenants and landlords about changes in the law and things like that? Or is there...
There are a couple of ways that we go about doing it. We will do, on occasion, direct mailing to the landlords or the tenants, depending upon which party's affected by it. We also do, on a monthly basis, conduct landlord certification programs, which are required to be licensed, and incorporate any new ordinance requirements as part of that. We will also fold in or include with other mailings that are sort of ancillary to it, say the annual rent report's about to go out or something like that. So we'll include additional information in that. There's also the newsletter and the website, et cetera.
The reason I asked is when I was campaigning, I talked to some tenants whose building had been purchased by somebody who then claimed they didn't know about the rent control in Tacoma Park. The interesting thing for me is that the tenants told the eventual purchaser before he purchased the property that the property, one, was too expensive and that he was paying too much for it, and two, that there was rent control, and the purchaser just decided to ignore what they had to say and then later complained about it. So there will always be, I think, people who either ignore the law, go around the law for whatever reason. There is no perfect kind of thing. I do think it's helpful, though, if both the tenants and the landlords know what the law is. So I do appreciate your efforts to at least send out the information. Whether people read it and absorb it, I guess, can't make them. But I appreciate that, because I think lack of knowledge really does hinder the process.
Would it keep all of the things that we're trying to do in effect, and could we do all of the notifications that we're talking about if we just, and we could avoid potential chaos if we just make the language so that so that it reads that they could rescind it any time up through the end of the closing, but not beyond that. Would it lose a lot of teeth, or would it keep most of what we're trying to do?
I think it would lose teeth, and I believe that's initially how it was written, and you all wanted it to have more teeth.
If you can, that means that if you can just keep the purchaser from finding out through the time of settlement, you're home free.
But if we sent this notice to the forms committee and we gave it to the title companies and we did all of those things, aren't they, even if the seller is trying to keep all this information from the buyer, aren't there now other parties who are going to be bringing that information in a timely fashion and make it happen before the close of settlement and not set up this possibility of everything breaking loose years down the road?
But if there's no possibility of things breaking loose years down the road, why would they bother? I mean, if they basically not.
So we're assuming that even disinterested parties have bad motives?
No, I'm saying that I don't. The proposal that you've got is where it started, and I think there was a concern that there wasn't really any teeth in that because, again, once settlement happens, doesn't matter, and parties may find out after settlement when the tenants complain that they're raising the rents without authorization, that's when they may find out.
I have to say, where I thought we started on this was in wanting to notify people that they were about to buy a rent-controlled property. I didn't think we were trying to set up a situation that had teeth necessarily. I mean, teeth is for enforcement. I thought we were doing education. We were doing an initiative that would try to keep people informed, and the teeth enforcement side of this, I'm uncomfortable with. I honestly see this setting up a situation where the city will become triangulated with the purchaser and the seller, and the seller could sue us because we set up this without any really liability. We set up this situation where they have to be informed, but we contacted the title companies, as many of them as we knew about, and tried to reach out to realtors and tried to get it in the form situation, but it's going to fall through the cracks, and I would think it would be a pretty big hit to anyone who 5 days after settlement found out they had to back it up and change direction or end up in court for a while. I would certainly see the seller coming after the city for that action.
Colleen?
I think maybe we should add a time limit on the rescinding. 6 months to a year. 6 months is probably plenty of time for you to figure out that you've got a rent-controlled unit and do something about it. No?
If you were to establish a time limit, I would do it at a minimum of a year.
A year.
Just in terms of the annual rent report requirements, because that's when a lot of people are discovered it.
That's when they find out? So
Not always, but that would be a natural.
Actually, they probably discover it when they come in to register the property and transfer the license to their name. And then they find out that, the certification program that we have, they find out that their unit is under control. But usually it's right away.
And the other thing I wanted to say, I think that would be a good idea. The other thing I wanted to say is I've only bought 2 properties in Maryland, but so far I have found the disclosure requirements comparative to other properties that I've bought in other states to be really weak. It surprises me that in Maryland you can just, as a seller, sign a document that says you refuse to disclose anything. And I mean, that to me, that was just, I couldn't believe that was possible. And I was stunned to find that, in fact, both of the people and in some cases the real estate agents that I bought the properties from just bald-faced lied to me and hid things, which they would have been sued for in the other state. And I'm still shocked when I open up the Homes Database website to look at houses that are for sale in Tacoma Park, multifamily houses, where it says, rents hundreds of dollars below market, buy this property and do a couple upgrades, and you can make, hundreds more than we're making right now. Now, a sane person would look at that and say, well, if they can make hundreds more, why aren't they? But, it just drives me nuts.
Okay. Do you have something, Mr. Hessel, do you have something different to say?
Or do you want to repeat the same thing?
I was just going to say before Councilmember Clay did that, I agree. Putting a time limit on it could avoid a nasty situation where somebody who learns about rent control, doesn't know what they want to do, just sits on it for 2-3 years before deciding to file a suit.
Okay.
Putting a time limit would be a very good idea, I think.
Okay, and you pretty much think that it should be a year, no?
And I would accept that as a friendly amendment from my colleague.
I think a year is a very long time.
Well, it is, but I think that's, if a possibility that somebody might not find out until their rent reports are due, I think means that we pretty much have to have a year. So it's so we would put something, Ken, how would the language work if we put in a year? To rescind the contract of sale at any time before the receipt of notice or within 5 days following the receipt of notice, up to a year following the date of settlement, something like that?
Is it another or is it linked?
It's not an or. It's a condition. Ken, can you give us some? We're making you word on the spot here.
Would you like to do it on the spot, or would you like to bring it back?
It's on the table. We would have to.
Yes, I know.
Would have to.
No, we'd have to table it.
Right.
I think that's wisest. I hate to make the last.
Move to table for 1 week.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? We will table it for 1 week with the notion that, Ken, you will work on inserting the additional, the year limit on the rescinding the contract, okay?
Okay.
Are you comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay, and we will bring it back in a week. All right, that concludes our regular meeting agenda. Since it is already 9 o'clock, I'm going to suggest we take a short break before diving into rent stabilization.
jump back through the other phone.
Okay, so you're listening to the computer, or you're listening to the meeting on your computer, right?
On the internet, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a little bit of a time delay I noticed one day. So if there's an odd pause.
Oh, okay, well, let's try the other way again then. Okay, ask them to speak again.
Did you say something to speak?
4, 5, 6.
Can you hear that?
Very little, we said some numbers or something.
Yeah. Why don't you put your headphones on and we'll just deal
Yeah,
with it.
I think that will be good enough.
Will that work?
Okay, well, then I'll put the headphones on and then,
Could-
yeah, respond through the landphone.
We can hear you, Ken.
That sounds good. We'll try that. Thank you very much. Appreciate you hanging around.
I'm here.
Okay.
All right, we are resuming our meeting with the work session discussion of proposed revisions to rent stabilization. We have a number of city staff at the table. And we have Dr. Yes. Yes. Yes, we can hear you. And
It's
we
a
have,
cell phone ad.
we have Dr. Ken Barr on the telephone, who is watching and listening to this meeting on the internet and will be providing advice and answers to any questions on the telephone. Too much technology is almost as bad as that.
I'm hoping this will work. It should be.
All right, go ahead.
The council is being asked to consider this evening 3 of the 9 recommendations that were presented by Dr. Barr in his November report following his review of the city's rent stabilization ordinance. The first is an exemption of properties based on the number of units in a building rather than the ownership, which is what the current law provides for. The second is an increase in the annual rent increase allowance. Currently, it's 70% of the consumer price index. The recommendation has been to increase that to 100% of the consumer price index. And third, we're asking the council to come to some consensus regarding provision of limited rent increases for existing tenants in cases where the actual rent is lower than the maximum allowable rent. Possibility would be a 5% increase or a 10% increase upon application, which could be instituted once every 5 years. There are other recommendations that Dr. Barr made that we're not going to be considering tonight. The first of that was his initial recommendation that landlords be allowed to implement unused rent increase allowances during an existing tenancy. He has withdrawn that recommendation based on his analysis of the data. We're also looking at referring any further discussion on recommendations 3, 5, and 9 and folding that into a single presentation where we would actually present you some legislated language so you could see what it is that we're talking about. And that would basically be folding the capital improvement rent increase petition and the hardship rent increase petition into a single rent increase petition process. We've also delayed or have pulled from the table discussion regarding the rent stabilization registration fee based on the lack of support that was indicated by the council during one of your previous work sessions. As far as the utility allowance survey, which was recommendation 2 in his report, we are incorporating the additional costs associated with that into the FY08 budget, and that'll be part of your discussion regarding the budget for next year. And then last but not least was recommendation 10, which was the ordinance that was just included at the previous agenda item regarding full disclosure of rent stabilization for real estate transactions. So of the 10 recommendations, we're asking the council to provide us input and hopefully build consensus on recommendation 7 regarding the number of properties that would be, or the types of properties that would be exempt from rent stabilization. Ask you to make a decision regarding the annual rent increase allowance and to consider limited vacancy increases, limited rent increases upon vacancy of units where the actual rents are less than the maximum allowable.
I wonder if I could take up the second of your items, which was the original recommendation number 1. It was my understanding that the council had tentatively agreed to go with 100% of the CPIs.
That was the initial discussion, and then Councilmember Siemens had indicated that, from his perspective, that was not the consensus, and he wanted to review it again.
And the reason being that if we were making these other changes, that first of all, these three things that we have on the table tonight seem to all interact or interplay, and that if we were allowing the annual increases to incorporate utility expenses, that is also a factor that's built into the CPI, and you were essentially providing for double counting or double allowance for some items such as utilities, and that didn't seem to hold with the goals that we have for rent stabilization.
Okay, then I appreciate that update, and I think then we should take them in the order that the staff suggests. The first one being the issue of exemptions. Currently, properties are exempt only if a individual property owner owns no more than one rental property within the city of Tacoma Park. And Dr. Barr's recommendation is that rather than basing it on the number of units owned, we base it on the number of units in a given building, and that we exempt buildings based on the number of units they contain. He did not make a recommendation to us as to where that cutoff point should be, but he recommended that that's the method that we use. Colleen?
I have a couple things to say about that, but before I say that, I want to back up a little bit to the issue about the utilities and moving forward and putting that in the budget. I realize that we have to plan for that in case that's the direction that the council goes, but I would really like to bring that issue back to another meeting, because I think that's just, there's a lot of complexity, and I printed out the information that HUD has on calculating utility allowances and all the different ways that they go through it, and they do it differently all the way around the state, and I brought in the Montgomery County utilities for, because basically I think it's work that's already done, and it's even broken out by whether it's natural gas, propane, electric, oil, for all the different kinds of heating. So I'm going to pass that down so that you all can see what's already available, and hopefully we can talk about that again at another.
So what you want to bring back is not the council's decision that it did want to make some kind of an adjustment for utility increases. What you wanted to bring back is the notion that we would do a individual analysis. I mean, an analysis just for buildings in Tacoma Park. You're suggesting that we also might consider standardized utility indices.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, these are
I just
Montgomery
wanted to
County
understand.
specific, and
Okay.
I think there's good reason to be confident in them, and they've even, if you look at the way they've done them, they've even split them out for different types of units. So
Okay.
there's a lot of information already there that I think we don't have to go back and redo that, but let's look at that another time.
Okay.
I also asked if we could have added for our information and I think everyone got one at their table, which shows the number of rental facilities by ward, and the number of units in the number of that many unit buildings in that ward. So you can see how many 2-unit buildings there are in each ward, and then how many actual total units that represents, to kind of help with the discussion there. And then I'm going to wait for other people to say what they have to say.
If I might add something, there's a second sheet of paper that I added or distributed prior to the meeting, in addition to the one with the tiny little numbers on it. There was a question that was raised, that was brought to my attention regarding the original chart that was included in your packet. To address any concerns regarding the information, I've added this last column here. The original chart just noted was a count as far as the properties that are subject to rent stabilization.
Right.
To clarify things, I've added this second set of columns that addresses the or reflects the total number of licensed rental units in Tacoma Park. Now, that number will be a little different than the number that is on the chart with the breakdown by wards, just because it's a different year, but the distribution has not varied significantly. So, for example, if you go across on the first column, the number of rental properties that have just one rental unit in them, there are 21 that are subject to rent stabilization, which reflects 21 rental units total. However, there are 273 single rental units out there, but because they are owned by just an individual who does not own any more, not all 273 of them are subject to rent stabilization.
Can I ask you a question on that, just to clarification, so that if someone owned a building that had 3 units in it, but only one was under rent stabilization program, that would be counted as a single unit then?
Correct.
Okay.
You mean if they lived in the other two, where they...
They had their families, yeah.
They family in the other two, yes.
Can I get a clarification on that as well? In some instances on this chart, the number of facilities subject to rent stabilization is more than the total licensed facilities, and that's because of...
The different times that the data was collected.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's...
Right. The numbers regarding the total licensed rental facilities will change again this next month. We've just sent out a billing to everyone for the 07 license and are getting a lot of notice of change of status reports. Properties sold within the last 12 months, and they're telling us about it, or they've taken it offline because they're undergoing a major renovation or it's been condemned, a variety of reasons. So the numbers will never totally match because of the different points in time that the information is collected.
Okay. Yes.
I haven't actually looked in detail, but on some of these charts, it looks like you simply multiply the number of units, no, times the. I mean, when you have do you have separate data that in it for a building that has both the number of units and the number of units under rent stabilization?
No, we do not. So
the level of detail is just at the building level.
It's the level of, we do not collect, though we're starting to now, the total number of units within a building. We pay attention to the number of rental units within that property. So as one of the other council members indicated, you could have a 3-unit building, 2 of the units were occupied by a family member.
So okay, I won't beat that one to death. I understand. Okay. The issue is on exempting properties based on the number of units in the rental, based on the number of units in the building.
Mayor Porter, I think when we get down to discussing, where the cutoff is, that I do have to recuse myself since I do own a building.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
I believe the recommendation is not about the size of the cutoff. It's just it's not the size of the cutoff. We're not discussing whether it be 1 unit or 2 unit or 3 unit or 8 units or 10 units. It's just the basis of the cutoff.
His recommendation was on the basis of the cutoff. That's right.
Right.
But he didn't make a recommendation on the size. But if we're going to do an exemption, we have to make a decision on what, if anything, what if anything we will exempt in terms of buildings.
Well, okay. So I guess I would ask a clarifying question. Currently, we have a number for that cutoff.
Yes.
And are you saying we will bring that up for discussion?
It has been brought up for discussion.
Okay. I got it now.
So if I, in order to try and move us forward, if I can say, I think we should make the change from the ownership to the size of the property, and if I can get a sense of if people are in agreement with that, then we can talk about numbers if we're in agreement that should be the case. Is that a good way to proceed?
I think we do have agreement on that. I think the only issue that was left unresolved is what that number should be.
And one clarification also, that will change the dynamic of what Terry's talking about, where you have a building with a number of units, but only some of the units in the building are rented, because it's based on the total number of units of the building, regardless of whether or not one of those units is owner-occupied or not.
That's correct. Right.
And I could try and make a case for cutting it off at 4 units. If that fails, I could make the same or a different argument for 2 units. And where I tend to go is I see a difference between people who own larger buildings and people who own smaller buildings. I think the smaller buildings tends to be individuals. It tends to be more likely to be in the form of a single-family house that may have been converted at some point in the past to a number of units within a house that if an owner were so inclined, they could convert back easily to single-family. And I would like to provide a little incentive for them to keep them as multifamily unit rather than reverting back to single-family, because I think that would keep more affordable housing in the city. And you could make arguments about how many units would be in a building that would make that possible. I know I was familiar with one where a house on, I think it was Kennebec, was 5 units and went back to single family. I know there have been other cases like that, but I thought 4 was a good number, so I'll put 4 out there.
So have we finished the discussion about the first issue about the basis for exemption?
We had that discussion actually before you got on the council,
Right.
so if there's anything you would like to add.
No, I'm perfectly in favor of doing it units on the property.
Okay, all right,
As recommended.
okay.
I think the issue for the number of exemptions, if we were to, yeah, that's right, I'll call it the cutoff. I think we would need more analysis than what we have in front of us before I feel like I could make any kind of a decision on it. My ward has a lot of very small buildings with a small number of units, and exactly where you draw that line makes a big difference, therefore.
I believe you have a number of buildings that have 3, 4, and 5 units in your ward.
Yeah, you can.
1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
1, 2,
Most
and
of them
3.
are 1, 2, and 3. Huge number.
Would you characterize those buildings as built multi-unit buildings or as built single families?
It's kind of both, actually. It's kind of both.
My sense of the ones that I'm familiar with is that most of the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s tend to be single family. But that could be different in different areas of the city.
I'm not familiar with all of the smaller buildings in Ward 5, but I'm familiar with some of them because we've had problems with tenant issues in a couple of them. And I think there are a number of them, like garden apartment type buildings that have 4 units in them that were obviously built that way. 2 up, 2 down kinds of things. I guess, let me just say a couple of things. One is that I understand the basic concern that this proposal is trying to deal with. And the basic concern, as I understand it, is that people who purchase like a 2-unit building, perhaps to live in one side and to rent out the other, or who purchase a building that then they have a tenant in a portion of it, are different kinds of property owners than those that purchase, say, a large multi-unit facility. And many of them don't make their living off of renting property. It's sort of a sidelight. They may be considerably less sophisticated than people who a big chunk or all of their income is gotten from the rental of property. And so we might want to exempt them from rent stabilization in order to not make it too difficult for someone who isn't actually drawing very much money from rental property. I do understand that. I guess on the other side, it seems to me, we have to weigh the loss of affordable units. And the concern that I have is that both of those things are important, and we have to be careful in how we weigh them. It isn't just what size building might be owned by someone who's unsophisticated and doing it as sort of a sidelight. But we also have to think about the loss of units. The council recently, in a gesture that I very much agreed with, did a payment in lieu of taxes that granted a building that had 200 and something units in it a tax offset of $1.3 million over 22 years in order to preserve 200 units of affordable housing. As I said, I think that's a very good idea and something that we should have done. On the other hand, I'm concerned that we not turn around and essentially let go a large number of potentially affordable units, given how difficult and costly it is to preserve them. So I guess I would weigh those things on each side. The number of 1 and 2 unit buildings in the city, the two of them together only provide 79 rental units. That doesn't seem to me to be an extraordinarily high number, and so I would be willing to support exempting the owners of buildings of 1 or 2 units. Yeah.
I had some conversation with some of the other council members and with the planning staff about selecting the right mark. And when we talked about this a while ago, I suggested 4 units because it seems like there's a level of sophistication that you hit when you get up over 4 units. You have to spend more time on your building or get someone to manage it for you. And HUD uses the 4 units as their threshold for the Fair Housing Act. I think in part acknowledging that is in fact the case, that there's some level of sophistication that you get when you get more buildings than that. And so I would support an exemption of 4 units and under. And I think that the other thing that I'm interested in is, I think it's perfectly reasonable that we use the rental housing market or economy in Tacoma Park to help provide affordable housing, just like with the, Fairfax has the penny for affordable housing. When housing sales turnover, they use the profit point at which people make money on their properties then to put money back into an affordable housing fund. And what I would like to consider is that instead of having a rent control situation, that for units 4 and under, we have a straight fee. And so that if you're 4 and under, you wouldn't be under the rent control and the management and the turning in all of the documents, but instead you would pay a yearly fee as part of your registration. I would suggest something in the range of $300 a unit.
And the notion would be that $300 a unit would go to offset both the cost of administering rent stabilization, and it would go toward offsetting the cost of the payments in lieu of taxes that we will very likely have to provide to nonprofits in the future to preserve affordable housing.
Well, I think that the operating expenses that we have, what is it, $225,000 a year is what we pay to administer certainly we could use it, we could talk about that, but, you know, one of the
I don't
things
mean earmarking it, I'm just sort of
Sure. Yeah.
thinking about how a fee translates into preserving affordable housing.
Well, I would set
wasn't meaning
aside-
to earmark it.
I would set aside a separate fund, and I would use the money to partnership with community housing organizations, and the one that we have the most experience with is Montgomery Housing Partnership, but certainly there are other affordable housing partners and developers available in the area to actually help to promote and to be an additional funding source that would help purchase units, basically. So you build equity in the project, and in return for an investment, you get long-term affordability. Basically, to help incentivize the money that already is out there from the county and from other organizations, the Washington Area Housing Partnership and other groups, to have them invest that money in Tacoma Park, because they get a little bit more from us. It makes us a more attractive place to spend tax credit dollars and other county funds to help either to purchase places like Montgomery Housing Partnership does, or to enter into other agreements that put those properties under long-term affordability restrictions. The other thing that I think that would do is that as those properties turned over into new renters, the value of those properties would go up, which would actually help our tax base bottom line as well. And that's money, I think, that helps us to pay for our affordable housing program. And that's where I would see the money coming to help offset the money that we're giving in tax credit payments.
If I could just respond to that for a second. If the concern that a number of members of the council had about raising the fees on licensed rental units before was the concern that it would be passed along to tenants. If there were no restriction on, if there were no rent stabilization, no restriction on what the property owner could charge, then it wouldn't be passed along to tenants because they'd be controlled by the market rather than by anything else. And so that, I think that concern wouldn't hold in this instance. I'm just thinking about it. Did you have something to say?
I'm intrigued by Colleen's proposal. I'd like to see more information about it, and I hadn't weighed in on the number of units, but I'd be comfortable with a proposal to have the cutoff at 4.
And if I could just add that based on the figures on the chart that we were given tonight, it would appear that the gross amount that would come in from that would be approaching 200,000. It's like 197.7, but then there's got to be a net because there's other fee that they had paid that might be different. I don't know, but
it wouldn't affect their rental licensing fee, presumably.
So it could conceivably generate about 200,000 per year.
The other thing that people should know as the council considers this, the council's aware of it, but I actually ran into someone who was under the impression that if their unit was out from under rent stabilization, was out from under code enforcement. And we should reiterate that that is not the case. Every licensed unit is going to be inspected and has to conform to code, whether it's under rent stabilization or not. So presumably we would still charge them the rental licensing fee because that pays for the code enforcement inspection process. I think Colleen's idea is interesting also. I don't know if 4 is the right number. I guess I would still be more comfortable with 2, but I'm not saying 4 is not doable. And setting a high fee presumably would be a reasonable, if we were to exempt units of a certain size, putting a fee on those units would be much less than what the property owners would get in additional rent. So I don't think it would be a hardship for them. It would definitely be a hardship for people who might not be able to afford those units, but maybe we could phase it in some way.
Well, I think what you would do is hold harmless the people who are in the units now, and as the units turn over, they roll out of rent control and into the fee system. So anybody who lives in one of those units now continues under whatever it is that the rent stabilization becomes after our discussions.
But I don't think you also want to create an incentive for people to be evicted.
Right, I don't know, when I originally talked about this with people, we talked about doing it on units where transferring once the units were voluntarily vacated. But Maryland has a prohibition on just cause eviction rules, but I don't know if that would stop us from how we would implement this. So if a unit was voluntarily vacated, then it would become eligible to roll out of rent control and into a fee-based system.
I thought the concern for the owners of small units was very well placed, and I think we might devote some effort into figuring out, instead of using a one-size-fits-all kind of exemption number, explore something along the lines of whether it's owner-occupied or not, rather than just some flat number across the city. Because I'm concerned that by using a number like 4, it's a large change. I mean, the current exemption is essentially 1, isn't it?
It's some ones, not all of them.
Right.
Yeah. It's according to my figures and based on the numbers we've got, it's 368 units that would be lost to affordable rents.
Right. And that's a large change. I'd like to, see a little more exploration of just who they are and what are some of the. There may be another break point that works better. But the two issues that concern me, one is that one, and the other is should we do the exemption on, instead of on just a straight number, do it on the basis of some, take account of whether it's owner-occupied or not, or whether it's, similar sorts of criteria.
I think many of us sort of started in that place, and I think we were advised by Dr. Barr that owner-occupied or not is something that could be manipulated, and that you couldn't really be sure whether the owner was in fact occupying it or not. And his advice to us was that while that was, a nice idea, in practice he felt that it didn't work. If you go from 4 units to 3 units, you save 136 units of currently affordable housing.
Maybe we could ask Sarah to talk a little bit about the folks who have been coming in, who purchased units, who are sort of under duress, and what you feel like the break is in sophistication of our landlords, and what area where we have the people who bought units that are in the most trouble, where we have the most at-risk stock. Because, to me, the issue is that we have a lot of at-risk stock in the city right now. And from what the conversations I've had, it sounds like the 4 and under area really incorporates most of the units that we're at risk of losing now. And we've already lost a lot of units. I think to me, 4 is the number that really gets us to the stop loss. But I don't know if they can speak to that at all. There's some sense of what that is.
Frankly, we don't track that, but based on staff's experience, the number of people that come in who have expressed frustration because they were unaware of rent stabilization or because they just can't get the numbers to work will be owners of properties or 6 or fewer units. Frequently, they live in one of the units, or they've got their family members living in a couple of the others. But it's again, it tends to be the smaller properties, though it's 6 and smaller are basically where we see that cutoff. Most of the people that purchase those properties are doing it because they can build equity in it. They've got a revenue stream that will help pay their mortgage for that particular property, and it's a place that they can call home. But again, it's difficult to call because we don't monitor it specifically like that. One of the things that Councilmember Williams and Mayor Porter may recall is that back in the late 1980s, that was when, prior to 1987, properties that have 4 or fewer units were not subject to rent stabilization. So single, 2, 3, and 4 unit buildings were what you're proposing or considering this evening. And then it was changed at that point in time to address the ownership aspect of it. The rationale behind the change, I'm not quite sure. But our experience is 6 and under.
Does the council want to come up with an idea and then, I mean, are there specific things that we need to look at? I guess I'm not sure what, if we say we'd like to look at some more information, I'm not sure what more information we could get. I mean, is there some specific idea as to how much more information we could get for something?
Yeah, I would like to see, there really is only a couple tables in here, and I'd like to see more about what things like whether these are part of, do you know if they're like garden apartment sort of style? I mean, what is the, you don't have that kind
We
of
wouldn't
information.
know that unless we went out and looked at
Right,
each
that's
of
what I
these
was afraid
buildings.
of. Because it's very attractive, the idea of exempting very, little, I'll call them little owners, but it's hard to figure out where that line is for me.
I mean, I appreciate what Colleen said about for was in fact, as Sarah said, it was the cutoff we used many, many years ago, that apparently it's a cutoff that HUD uses for a number of its applications of regulations. It's also, there's a certain logic, it seems to me, also to both 1 and 2, in that certainly 1-unit buildings, and in likelihood many 2-unit buildings, are purchased primarily as homes with rental units in them, and they may later become rental units for a period of time, and then go back to being homes. So I can see certainly the issue with the 1 and 2 units. Going up to 6, if you went up to 6, you're losing over 700 units of affordable housing.
We're not necessarily advocating that. We're just answering
Okay.
the question.
That's a fair number. So
Would it make sense to have staff analyze the options of 4 versus 6?
now they said they're not recommending 6.
We were just answering the question. That's not our recommendation.
But if I remember
I'm not
correctly,
asking if you're recommending 6. I'm asking if you could analyze 4 versus 6.
is there? Let me just see if there's any interest in exempting 6.
Only strategically to fall back to 4.
Well,
Well, I do, for instance, I wonder, for example, how many owner-occupied houses are fourplexes in which the owner sits in one and has 3 other units. When I was around, there were a fair number of those that were built that way, built as those kind of fourplexes.
when we, let me start again. In the information that we have on buildings with rental units, do we know which ones are owner-occupied?
No, see, that's what I was afraid of. Don't have the information.
We only know the number of rental units, and
Right.
we may know in some cases. I know that in a couple of instances where people have come to me, it was very clear from the information they gave me at what point the owner moved into the building, because the building was a 4-unit building and one of the units went off the rental market because of their occupancy.
We have the information on the application forms, but we don't have it entered into any database or anything like that. So it would, I mean, it's available, but it would take some time to do that because we'd have to go through each of the individual property funds.
You know, the piece of information that I would want to have, which is, as far as I can tell, is not available, is what are the economic situations of people who live in 4-unit buildings versus people who live in high-rise buildings. And, you know, from talking to the landlords, one of the impressions that I get is that the people who are most likely to take in 5 or 6 applications and take the person with the absolute highest salary of all the applications after they then also personally interview people are people who have smaller unit buildings. And so, you know, it seems to me like in part that, and, you know, it's just a sense that I have, but that the smaller unit buildings are going to be more likely to be the buildings where, as the gentleman on the Tacoma Voice said, he only rents to people who make $100,000 a year or more. And they're rent-controlled units, and then he doesn't put in any repairs, and he just assumes that the people he rents to, because they make so much money and they only pay $500 a month, they're going to do the painting and the repairs. And I think those are the most likely buildings where that's going to happen and where we get sort of the least bang for our buck in terms of the rent stabilization. The other thing I want to point out...
I think we should send the housing code inspection people out there to his buildings.
Well, wherever the
I think we
Tacoma
can take
Voice
care of that
is,
pretty clearly. Go ahead, sorry.
That's all right. So, and the other thing that I want to say is, you know, to really try to get a fund where we could make an impact every year on 1 or 2 buildings. 2 units isn't going to do it. If you go up to 4 units and everyone who has the 4 and under pays $300 fee, then you get about $200,000. But if you just do it for 2 and under, you only get $120,000. And I think if you want to have the money every year to help get someone like Montgomery Housing Partnership a little more interested in a building, to just take it over the top. Some of these buildings that are in the, you know, 5 to 10 unit range, you know, $200,000 is a lot more money than $120 when you need an extra $10,000 per unit, or you need $20,000 per unit. You know, at $20,000 per unit, you can have an impact on 10 units. And since the county only allows $80,000 for each unit, you know, you're putting in a quarter of the cost of the purchase of that unit. That makes you a major player in the game. But with only $120,000, it really doesn't.
Well,
It's not as big of an impact.
I don't think either one of them is a magic number. It seems to me, again, in my mind, I'm balancing the concern about the hardship to the property owners to the loss of affordable units. I don't see that I could go above 4 just because I'm looking at the number of rental units that would be lost. I do agree with Colleen in that, you know, certainly if we do lose units as affordable units, charging a fee that will then help us protect some of the remaining units is a good idea. But I'm not looking at this as a moneymaker, because you know, it's unclear to me whether over time we would save more units than we would lose. I don't know. But I think certainly if the council decides to go with an exemption of a certain number, charging the fee is a very good idea. Bruce.
And if I can just add one thing on if we go the charging the fee for the exempt units idea, what I'd love to do is what I think we always have to fix when we deal with things like this of, well, gee, it's been X number of years and that fee hasn't changed. I would love to make it that it starts out at if it's a $300 fee, that it gets increased by the CPI every year, and that way nobody's having to fix it. It kind of marches along with what would be happening if it was under rent control, or, you know, I think it's the right way to go.
It seems to me that, and I'm going to say this not as something that necessarily I personally agree with, but it seems to me that the council is sort of starting to coalesce around the 4-unit number. I still have some concerns. I'm understanding that Councilmember Snipper still has some concerns. would it be reasonable, in order not to burden the staff with costing out 17 options, if we asked them to do some further research on the 4-unit option? Would the members of the council be agreeable to that? It's sort of a tentative decision pending additional information. You have, as I said, 368 currently rent-stabilized units that are 4 units or in buildings of 4 units or less. And so anything that we ask them to take a look at, they would have to look at 368 units in approximately 130 buildings. Yeah.
I guess the one thing I'd ask the staff to put together would be a model so that we could differentiate the fee by size of the unit, so that it averaged out to this or something close to this, so that a person who has a 3-bedroom doesn't pay $300, while a person who has a accessory apartment also pays $300, but that you develop a spread, a reasonable spread. Does that make sense? I know that's.
Are you talking about the fee
The
applied
fee.
to the landlord or the tenant?
No.
The fee to the landlord. The landlord pays the fee. So
And
College
based-
Park
based
does
on
that.
unit size.
Yeah, based on unit size.
And you're talking about something over and above what they currently pay for licensing?
Yeah, this doesn't include licensing. This is,
Because they pay, what, like 70, what is it, 76 now?
something like that.
Is it 76 per unit for licensing?
$86.
I'm sorry, 86. My memory begins when it was 60-something, so I don't remember that.
If I could ask for some clarification in terms of what additional information or analysis you would like?
I don't think
Did you-
the additional information I want isn't available, so.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, not easily available.
And the additional information I want is just the example of how it would go together.
What would go
How to
together?
go
How this would, if we did this, is there anything that we've missed in terms of implementation based on your knowledge of what we're dealing with?
What I would envision, at least based on the information I have right now, is that this would be very similar to the rental housing license fee, where people would be billed on an annual basis, and the timing of that would be something we'd have to look at. Another option would be for them to apply for an exemption, but that might create a whole lot of additional work for the property owner as well as additional processing in-house. So we'd look at that and find out how it might be implemented.
Yeah, how we'd phase it in.
So could you produce some charts like this with, say, 3 and 4 unit splits, or even 2, 3, and 4?
Showing.
Get an idea. Just to get an idea, because I think Colleen's proposal is very intriguing.
Oh, in terms of the prorated fee, if you will?
Right.
So you're talking about the size of the units?
Oh, if we're going to do 2, let's do 6 too then.
Sure.
Wait a minute, Colleen's,
I'm just kidding, I just wanted to.
Colleen's proposal is to vary the fee based on the number of,
Right.
by the size of the unit. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I wanted to see how much the total dollar would be as well.
If you did 300 times the number here, right?
2 units is 118,500, and 4 units is 197,700.
And the whole idea was to, if it's based on the size of the unit, make it work out to about those figures.
Right. So I see what you're saying. So you'd have to know the size of the units part.
Which I think we do know.
Yeah, it's in the level.
We do know the size of the units, how many bedrooms in the units that are,
Right.
that we're
We do
licensing.
have that. One of the things that Linda, she were whispering, is that a challenge we have is that people are not hesitant to remove walls or add walls, depending upon whether or not it's to their advantage or disadvantage. So it may generate some additional activity that you weren't anticipating. For example, some of the property owners in this last 2 years have been adding walls to their living rooms so that it creates a 3-bedroom rather than a 2-bedroom, which then creates a new unit, so it's not subject to rent stabilization, or it can establish a new base rent. If you were to base the lower fee on the, or if you were to prorate the fee based on the size of the individual unit, so for example, it was an efficiency would be a lower fee than a 1-bedroom. One of the things that might take place, and though I don't know how probable it would be, is to have the bedroom removed, so then you have an efficiency where before you had a 1-bedroom.
And make the efficiency in the 1-bedroom the same. I think to some extent that's going to it's going to reduce the incentive to do that, because since they get to charge market rates afterwards, if they do bizarre, funky things to their place, it's less marketable. Right now, if they feel like it doesn't matter because I don't get enough money anyway, I don't care what it looks like, somebody's going to rent it because it's cheaper than anything else 50 miles around, they're much more inclined to do that kind of crazy stuff.
Well, I must confess to being a little confused. So originally what I thought I was hearing is that you were talking about prorating it, if you will, on the number of units in the building. You're not necessarily talking about prorating it by the number of units, but by the number of bedrooms within the units.
Bedroom size.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you really think they're going to do that between an efficiency and a 1-bedroom, make them be the same.
I don't
I
think
don't know
they
how
are,
probable it'll
because
be,
they
but
can
it's
charge
just
more
sort of
for a
like, this is something
1-bedroom than an
that's
efficiency.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yes,
please.
Dr. Barr?
Yes, I guess my reaction is that, I mean, to have this complexity of having exemption fee depending on the number of bedrooms in a unit, it's becoming extremely complex, and you're only talking about exemption that affects about, depending on what exemption you take, adopt, it might be 120 or 300 units. And I don't know if there's some simpler measure, for example, if the assessor's record has the square footage, but I think really you should just have one size exemption for all units, because I think the complexity exceeds the benefit.
You mean one fee for all units?
For different size units.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he means.
So that, in case people can't hear.
That's a perfect world, but it's so complex doing it.
I appreciate, Dr., I'll repeat it since I don't know if you came across on the microphones. Dr. Barr, who's listening to this, recommended that we not vary the fee based on the size of the units because it introduces another layer of complexity. And I do want to thank Dr. Barr because he has on a number of occasions tried to pull us back from making things too complicated. So I appreciate his watchdogging this.
College Park does it, so we should look at how they do it.
I think it's worth looking at, but I do appreciate what he said. I want to get back to the staff's question about if we have size of units. I would be interested in seeing how the size of units break down by the number of units in the rental facility. In other words, I wouldn't want to end up exempting only large apartments or only small apartments. That would be a concern that I would have. In other words, just like you did the spreadsheet of number of units in rental facility by ward, if you could do number of units in rental facility by size of the unit.
The physical size of the unit or the number of bedrooms?
The
within
number of
size?
bedrooms is, I think that's what you've got, isn't it?
Yes.
Because otherwise I think it would be too complicated.
Do you also have the I don't know what to call it, the gap between the rent as charged and the allowable rent? Because that's something that was pretty striking for me, how many units do not charge the total allowable rent.
If you look at Table 4, page 6 of the analysis that Mr. Barr prepared for us, we had asked him to break that out down into 2 levels, one for 4 and fewer units and the other 5 or 20 or more units. And it does give you some information in terms of what the differences are between the base rents and the actual for this types of properties that you're referring to at this point.
Yeah, and it was pretty striking how many units did not charge the full rent.
It was also interesting that the smaller buildings were closer to their ceilings on average than the bigger buildings were. One additional question that came to me as you were talking about the moving walls and things. Is there any way that we can control for people who, say, have a 5-unit building or a 6-unit, supposing we decide to go with a 4-unit unit building exemption, is there any way we control for people who have a 5 or 6-unit building, putting a door through between 2 of their units and declaring that they're now a single unit, and the 2 different families who are living in the 2 units are now roommates? Is there anything we can do about that?
Probably not. I mean,
Most of the 6-unit properties have like 3 units, right? 3 different floors. On-grade floors. Yeah, and a stairwell in the middle is what many of them have.
I have a comment.
Yes?
There are ways I imagine you could deal with it. One you could say is that somebody's not eligible for the exemption if they reduce the number of units in the building in order to get the exemption.
Okay. That would be fairly simple. Thank you again for Dr. Barr's recommendation was that one way to get around that would be to say that people cannot qualify for the exemption if they have reduced the number of units below the exemption number specifically to get the exemption. And presumably we could write that in such a way that it had something to do with time, or we weren't trying to look at people's motives. Okay, is everyone comfortable where we are now, that we're looking at the 4 and getting some additional information, and the council will revisit this at a later date? All right, can we move on to the issue of the annual increase? Now, Terry, when you said you wanted to put off the discussion of the percent of the annual increase, did you mean you only wanted to talk about it in terms of its relationship to the utility, or can we talk about it in terms of what we're intending to do and get sort of an outline? Obviously,
I was suggesting that the vacancy decontrol was duplicative and with other changes that we are discussing or proposing, and so I was voicing no support for that at this point.
So you don't have a concern with talking about the first recommendation, which is what the annual rent increase allowance should be?
I'm certainly open to discussing that, yes.
Okay. I think that what we had on the table was 100% of the CPI. Is there any additional issues about that? I think we pretty much had decided on that.
And my concern with that is the utilities.
Okay.
That if we are making provision to allow the landlords to increase rents because of such things as the rapid increase in the utilities, that is a factor, I think, in the CPI, and so it would be a duplicate allowing the landlords to raise rents twice for the same expense.
That would be something that you could take into consideration when you evaluate the information that's gathered during the survey of the utility costs and consumption figures. Would that be appropriate, Dr. Barr, in terms of looking at it at the time?
Yeah.
So until that information is collected, you're not looking at doing any utility allowances or adjustments for property owners that pay utilities. You could take it into consideration at that point in time when you do evaluate the data to see if it's appropriate to adjust the rent increases or provide a utility allowance if the CPI is not adequate. Does that make sense?
And I think I'm in agreement with where Terry is headed, and I think that a change we could make at that point, if we decided to implement at the point at which we decided to implement utility allowances, we could presumably, there is either, or we could create, based on the relationships within the CPI, a CPI less utilities, right?
I'm concerned about administrative costs or complexity and the costs associated with that, making this too complex.
It's already very complex.
But that's how you make
I
your
said
money.
it's already very complex.
Oh, I realize that, and I think we've talked about making things less complex where possible, and certainly not adding more complexity. I'm sure Councilmember Clay has some good suggestions, so let's let her go.
I was going to basically repeat what the other folks have said, but say that I absolutely would support that we address that issue on the utility side. I think it'll be much easier there. If we have a uniform CPI 100% increase, I think that's much clearer to people and they understand what their base rent is. I think it's easier to understand a base rent that's common plus utilities for the people where we have to address utilities instead of a CPI with utilities base rent plus the additional utilities that the CPI doesn't take into effect, and then one without it, when you've got this whole spread of these different kinds of utilities that you provide and different ways, whether you use gas or propane or electricity to provide that particular service. I just think it's going to be much easier, and I think we should just acknowledge that we're going to, when we make the fee, it won't be, this is exactly what it
You
costs.
mean the
whatever it
utility
is.
allowance?
Yeah, this is exactly what it costs, but this is what it costs less whatever is already calculated into the CPI.
I agree, and I think my reaction to Terry's concern is that we have to start somewhere. You've got a chicken and an egg, and I agree that going with the CPI, 100% of CPI is a good way to go, and I think the concern about double counting is that some of the harm on the utilities is from what's been happening in the past, particularly with the 70% of CPI, and that the way you address that is as you implement the whatever change is happening for the utilities, you've got kind of looking at what's been happening and then saying, okay, is there anything to do with that, and then how do we proceed into the future?
I think this argument has some merit, although I'm not supportive of it, has some merit when the landlords pay the utility costs. When they don't, then we're allowing a CPI increase on the allowable rent that does include the utility cost factor, while it's the tenant who's actually paying the utility costs. So in that case, the landlord would be benefiting from the increased costs of utilities, although the landlord is not incurring the expense. It's the tenant that's incurring the expense.
If you were to establish a utility surcharge, it would only apply to the property owners that are paying for the utilities.
But my contention is that the CPI includes costs associated with utilities. And so in that case, 100% CPI increase on a building where the landlord does not pay the utilities, the landlord's benefiting from the increase in the cost of utilities, while the tenant is the one who's paying for the utilities.
I agree with you, Terry. I think that's a good point, but I think I'm gonna go back to the point Dr. Barr keeps making to us, is that sometimes the simplicity is more important than the fine-tuning it to the exact point. I think I'm not uncomfortable with going with 100% CPI because it's all an approximation anyway, and I'm afraid that we're getting to a point of fine-tuning that's going to get washed out by the rounding approximations, estimated formula corrections in the CPI anyway.
I certainly support the concept of simplicity and appreciate Dr. Barr's suggestion that we keep that in mind. And I think it would be just as simple to say that we go 80% of CPI rather than 100%. It would keep the calculation just as simple and would err on the side of the tenants rather than on the side of the landlords.
I think this is a very interesting discussion, but if you look at, I return to this point, I think it's quite startling that you get 60% of the units not charging the full rent that they're eligible to charge. regardless of the fact that we in the past have used, say, 70% of the CPI and so on. It indicates to me, anyway, that the landlords, the majority of landlords, are in fact, for whatever reason, they like the tenants or they don't want to risk having the place be vacant, whatever the reason might be, are in fact managing their properties that way. So I think some of this
So does that mean you agree with me then?
I can see your point, yeah, very, very much so, yeah. But I would be comfortable with either one because I think the dollar amount, whether you go with 70% of the CPI or 100% of the CPI, is relatively small. You're talking about a few dollars a month. I think potentially some of the utility costs, if they were passed on, could be substantially larger. In addition to, of course, there's an issue we haven't discussed. If we move to exempting the smaller units, then the remaining units will be those that are tend to be more of investment properties. They tend to be the larger units, and for them, they're actually making their money as an investment. They're leveraging their money and making, which is that kind of profit that they make is not passed on at all to the tenants. So for them, I think the 70%, you could argue the 70% of the CPI or some of these others would be a way of capturing some of that for the tenants.
Except I thought the argument you were going to make with that was if they're not charging the market rates now anyway, it doesn't matter whether it's 70 or 100. You go to 100, it still doesn't matter. The tenants aren't going to be paying.
But a new tenant might.
That is pleasant, but the new tenant, right.
I just want to remind everybody that we have a boarded-up building with a whole lot of units in it, just sitting right down the street from us. And there are some people who would rather board up their buildings than cope with the rent control and the low rent returns. And we've got, large landlords threatening to sue us and, over this issue. And I think if you look at the consultants' commentary on fair return and legal standards of fair return, this issue has been looked at in every state except Maryland. If we get sued, it's a ripe case in Maryland because there's any case law on it, and he has indicated that 100% is not required, but that was the standard that was evaluated in the other cases.
Which is why I feel, one of the reasons I feel comfortable with 100%, actually.
I want to caution us against assuming that boarded-up facilities are because of rent stabilization. I think those of us who've been on the council for a number of years are aware of a number of instances where facilities, multi-unit facilities, were boarded up for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with it.
I was surprised. I'm sorry. I was surprised to hear that the rate of condo conversion, for example, which is frequently cited as a problem in Tacoma Park, that the rate of condo conversion in Tacoma Park is not higher than the rest of Montgomery County.
It's not. I'm sorry.
I was just going to add that the boarded-up building that I believe that Councilmember Clay was speaking about is more to do, I think, with the personal situation than it is with the city government.
One of the discussion points this evening is the cost of utility and the double counting, if you will, regarding the increase in the rents. If you turn to page 2 of the data that was provided by Dr. Barr on February 15th, he doesn't have any percentages there, but roughly 85% of the property owners that have units that are subject to rent stabilization pay for the heat. So a majority of the utilities, at least for the most expensive ones, are paid for by the landlord and not the tenant. Does that make sense?
And the other thing that is not based on analysis, but is based on my observation, is that the smaller unit buildings are the ones that are most likely to directly meter the tenants. It's certainly the very, very large buildings don't directly meter the tenants.
That's true.
Colleen.
I just want to say that is my professional belief that condo conversion is driven by different issues in Montgomery County than it is in Tacoma Park. And I don't think that those are comparable issues. And that's all I'll say.
Okay, I'm hoping we won't get off onto that. It seems to me that, at least at this point, a majority of the council is tentatively willing to go forward with 100% of CPI, with a proviso that we will relook at this when we look at the utility, excuse me, it is getting late, utility allowance. And so I'd like to suggest that unless there's a strong objection, that we move forward with that as sort of a tentative. And all of these are in some sense tentative until we get a chance to look at the whole package. We may put together a package piece by piece and then not like the whole and have to go back and revisit pieces of it. Let's take up the last issue, which, silly me, I thought was going to be the most contentious. The limited rent increases upon vacancy of rental unit. You want to just just summarize for us, in case there are people who are listening to this who've forgotten what the proposal is?
Essentially what the proposal is that a property owner, upon the voluntary vacancy of a rental unit, where the tenant has decided to move or has been asked to leave because they haven't paid their rent or their lease violations, would be provided an opportunity to increase the maximum allowable rent by a percentage higher than the annual rent increase allowance. And that added bump, if you will, would only be allowed once every 5 years. So for example, if you're renting a property and your maximum allowable rent is $650, you could make application to the COLTA, who would look at it, and you could get approved for an additional 5% increase in that maximum allowable rent to adjust for market conditions and things like that. You wouldn't be able to do it on an annual basis, and you would have to actually apply for it so it could be monitored. But that would be one way of addressing some of the concerns that people are not recognizing some of the return on their investment that they might otherwise if the the rent increase allowance was higher, or if they, for some reason or another, had not taken the maximum allowable rents. There were a couple of options, if I recall correctly, that were provided. One was a 5% increase. You could do a 10% increase. And it was suggested by Dr. Barr that it be something once every 5 years. I did the numbers for just a 650 unit maximum allowable. It would add about $50 on top of that, plus whatever your annual rent increase allowance would be.
What were you thinking of as the standards that COLTA would use to evaluate this? On what basis would they grant or not grant?
It would basically be just to monitor the frequency with which the increase was taken. And that
So everybody would be allowed to do it?
The way it's proposed right now is that if you elected to increase your maximum allowable rent, you would be allowed to do that once during any time frame. We'll pick 5 years. Make an application for that, and then that would get acknowledged.
Even if you had just had a very large capital improvement petition increase?
That would be one of the details that you could work out. But right now, it's just based on the assumption that it's just what the maximum allowable rent would be. Is that correct? A fair summary, Dr. Barr?
Yes, I think at one point I commented that you could not permit it if the owner got an exceptional capital improvement increase last during some time period before the vacancy. Did you hear what I said? Or?
Yes, we heard. I'll repeat it. Dr. Barr said that at one point he had said that we could choose not to allow it if the owner had recently received a large capital improvement increase. I guess, let me just say from the beginning that of all the issues that we're talking about this evening, I think this is the one that I have the most problem with. I understand the purpose of it. The purpose of it is it's supposed to be sort of a rough way of allowing property owners who have fallen behind, whose properties have fallen behind what they need to keep the property operating could catch up. But I thought that's what this new net operating increase, whatever we're going to do with the combination of hardship and capital improvement was supposed to be for. So I'm a little concerned that we're creating multiple avenues to the same end and ones that could potentially be taken on top of each other. Colleen?
It seems like a pain in the neck to administer, and I think much better that we spend our energies on a functional and appropriate whatever return on investment net operating expense mechanism than this.
Wow, that wasn't what I expected you to say.
Look for the hidden message.
Yeah, I see that. We'll come back later. To me, I understand from talking to some landlords that if you had a really good tenant, so you did not raise the rents each year to what the maximum was because you wanted the tenant to stay, but then that tenant left for whatever reason, he retired after 20 years and went to Florida, I don't know, whatever, that the landlord was looking for an opportunity to essentially recapture those foregone rents. And since we have dropped that other provision, which I actually agree with, that this might be an opportunity for that kind of adjustment. So I actually, despite the difficulty of implementing this, which I thoroughly understand, I actually support some limit. I'm not exactly sure of what percent is the right percent, but
I think maybe if I can just jump in here and clarify. I think right now landlords are allowed to increase their rents up to the maximum rent stabilization limit upon vacancy. That's in the law now. What Dr. Barr had proposed is going 5% or 10% above that, which is why I have the concern. I think that property owners should have the right to go up to their rent stabilization limit on vacancy. I think that's good, and that would certainly catch them up. It wouldn't catch them up for the foregone rent, but if they're choosing to forego rent because their decision is that keeping a good tenant saves them more money than they lose by not raising the rent, then that might very well be a good business decision, and I don't know why they would need to be compensated for that. But definitely go up to the maximum allowable, but not above that.
So I agree with Colleen.
I don't know. This is an amazing discussion. I didn't expect you to say that. First, as I understand it, we've put in measures to help to get the rents up to what people feel is more profitable for the landlords, and then we're doing a 100% CPI every year. So basically, it's in concept going to stay at just as profitable from year to year. We have a provision there for what we used to call hardship, and I can't remember what we call it now, but we have a provision in there for capital improvement increases. And so it seems, again, like the vacancy decontrol provides some duplicity. But I think there are, as Councilmember Snipper pointed out, there are some cases that we've heard about where landlords have been generous to tenants, but that our current law keeps them from being able to put things back in line when the elderly person that they were trying to be helpful towards leaves their apartment, that they're then able to not able to get the apartment rent back up where it belongs. But that's the other measure that's
no, the law now says that if you've been holding rents below the rent stabilization limit, when your current tenant leaves, you can raise it all the way up to the limit. That's the current law.
So,
and the proposal that was in Dr. Barr's report would let you raise it above the current rent stabilization limit.
okay.
And that's why I'm opposing it. Bruce?
Did you want to clarify anything?
Yeah. One of the properties that this might be most appropriate to consider for is when rent stabilization was initially enacted, property owners who had very low rents that they were charging at that point in time because they had a good tenant or something along those lines. If they had rents that were lower than in the typical market for the area, because it was an incentive to keep that particular tenant there, would probably benefit the most from this because their maximum allowable rents are disproportionately lower than others of the comparable property. Does that make sense?
And if that's the case, then I could support this for those tenants because it's a limited domain that we would be able to control, and over a period of time we would no longer have that.
But how would we tell who those people were?
I think that those people are mostly in buildings that are smaller buildings. You know, I would say 2 to 4 or 5 units. And it also happened at the time where the law changed from less than, properties with less than 5 were under rent stabilization, and all of a sudden only units were under rent stabilization, changed to 1 unit. So those people were caught charging lower rents, and there was no way to recapture that once they became under rent stabilization. So if you're going to be changing the law to exempt units that are 4 and less, I think you're going to reach all of those properties and those units through that part of it.
Okay, that confirms what I was thinking, which was some of the other things we're doing are addressing the concern, and I don't feel like we need to do this one.
Okay, that I think we've got a agreement on that too. So if I can just recap on the issue of exemption of properties, we're saying tentatively subject to further discussion for the annual rent increase allowance, we're saying tentatively subject to further discussion, particularly discussion on the utility allowances, 100%, and on limited rent increases upon vacancy of a rental unit, we're saying no. Am I correctly understanding where we are? Okay. Do you all, do we need to do anything more on those issues? Okay. All right. I think that we then have successfully dealt with those, at least tentatively. And we will bring the rest of them back at a later point. Is there something you wanted to say, Sarah?
Basically, my assumption is that the next step is to work with Dr. Byer to actually develop language that you would be able to look at, a proposed ordinance, if you will, that would include these revisions as well as specific language regarding the option to the alternative to the capital improvement rent increase petition and hardship rent increase petition. So the next time you see us, you'll have specific words or language in front of you, which may make it a little easier to evaluate.
Does it make sense to do that prior to our making a decision on all of the items, though? Because we are reserving to ourselves the right to go back once we put the whole animal together and make sure it's a horse and not a camel.
It seems maybe wasteful to spend money for a consultant to help us create language that we don't have at least some positive feelings about. We haven't discussed the utilities, and we haven't agreed to some of the others.
The utility allowance survey will not happen until next fiscal year.
But I want to. I think that the recommendation that Colleen made was that we take up as an alternative to doing a utility survey, we take up some of the standardized numbers that she's got. Now, I don't know how that fits in with the situation, but I think it's certainly worth our having a discussion about. So perhaps the next time we could take up the question of, do we need a utility survey, or could we use some standardized measure? And the issues having to do with the merging of the capital improvement and the hardship petition processes. Can we do both of those the next time?
We have evaluated different ways of presenting the information to you for the alternative rent increase petition, and have come to the conclusion, and perhaps we're wrong, is that it might be easiest for you to actually see the language or the ordinance so you can address all of your issues. Because right now, my sense is it's sort of this gray, fuzzy thing that people don't really have their hands around.
But I don't think that the problem is that people don't understand exactly what we're doing. I get the sense is that people's agreement to some things is conditional based on other things that we might do. And so until we see the whole package, I'm not sure that, am I
Yes, I agree
misspeaking?
with you.
And until we see the whole package, we're not going to, I can speak for myself, until I see the whole package, I'm not going to be sure whether I agree with all the pieces.
Therefore, we need language for the whole package.
No, I think therefore we need to decide what the whole package is before we pay a consultant and staff to get down to the detail of the language.
Right, I agree with Terry.
Now, okay, and let me just make another point if I'm understanding what you're saying. You're saying that it's going to be difficult for you to present the package on capital improvements and hardship without having firm decisions on the other pieces? Is that what you said?
No, I was just thinking we could bundle it all together and start working on drafting some of the language. I mean, if you decide to go from 100% of the CPI back down to 70 or 80, you know, it's a very simple revision as far as the language. The
Okay.
same thing would be in terms of what size, what properties are subject to rent stabilization or not.
I don't have an objection to your starting to do the languages, to do the language. If we make a major change and you have to go back and redo it, you know, that's your time and...
Our money.
Well, it is our money. But I don't think it would be useful to present that language to the council at this point, because I think you're solidifying into language something that people aren't going to be able to agree to until they see the whole package.
But I think that the concept of combining the capital improvement and hardship petitions into one rent increase petition that maintains net operating income. It seems like there's been agreement on the council about doing that, and I think all these other things that you're talking about doing will impact the numbers when somebody applies. They'll have higher income if they're getting a larger CPI or a utility allowance, but I don't think that it'll really change the policy, because the policy behind it is kind of the fundamental part of what we're trying to do is protect the net operating income to make sure that the statute's constitutional.
Start working on language and come back with the other pieces that we still have to...
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess that's what I'd say too. Let's talk about the policies on the remaining pieces first, but if you want to start working on the language in the meantime.
So at this point in time, we'll
As
bring
long
back
as
to
long
you
as the city doesn't have to pay for any changes that the council makes afterwards. No, I'm kidding.
So at this point in time, we will come back again with information on the exemption of properties based on the number of units. And we'll come back again with information on the annual renting or the annual allowance.
No, the annual allowance is going to get discussed again when we talk about how we do the utility allowance. I mean, I think we need to have a discussion of the proposal that Colleen's put on the table to use a standardized utility allowance rather than basing it on a survey.
We had presented that information to you at a previous work session. Would you like the same type of information again?
Well, I would like that same type of information and some of the things. If I glanced at the stuff Colleen passed around, but I think it's different than what we had talked about before.
This is the fair market rents with the utility allowance, right?
This is just the utility allowances that HUD uses, and I brought in they have two different calculation methods, but it's actually the county that's doing it every year, and they line it out based on what the services that's provided, like is it a gas stove or an electric stove? Do they provide propane heat, electric heat, or gas heat? I mean, it's really finely detailed, and it's current every year. I don't think we could do better than they do. And it has to meet the federal government standards. And
I think there are questions about, I don't know the answer to these questions, about how the utility allowances were updated by HUD, because sometimes they're updated based on price indexes, sometimes they're updated based on actual surveys. So I think we have to have more information to know whether that HUD information is useful.
Yeah, I don't just, Dr. Barr was noting that we need to know more about how the standardized indices are created before we can decide whether they're appropriate. I agree with that. And I assume that between now and whenever the staff brings this back, that they will look into that. And if they feel that there are some serious concerns with the or if you do, Dr. Barr, feel that there are some serious concerns with the standards that Colleen mentioned, that you will let us know about that. But I think it's worth at least the council scheduling a discussion of those two things, how we do the utility allowances and what the impact on the 100% increase may or may not be, and then the package that would include the items related to the non-standard, non-annual rent increases. This rent increases based on net operating costs.
My feeling is, I might be wrong, I don't think that the utility survey should be a huge expense, because basically it's asking owners to provide utility bills for a year, which they have to keep for tax purposes anyway. Mainly the heat bill, and I'm not so concerned about the water, because that's more standard.
Yeah, Dr. Barr is saying that he doesn't think that the survey that's required would be very extensive. You may very well be right. I'm not arguing for the standardized allowances. I'm just suggesting that the council might take up that discussion with you and the staff, having had the benefit of some of the information that Colleen has passed around the council. I don't have a sense of which way it should go, but I do think that it's worth having the council take a look at it. If you feel it's a terrible idea, then definitely tell us why you think we should not do that and we should do something else. Okay?
And if I can just add my 2 cents worth on drafting language versus no drafting language, I prefer to think that we've come to some more than vaguely tentative conclusions tonight, and I think you should begin putting stuff together. And yes, we may tweak it as we get all the pieces together, but I don't think that's a reason to think that we haven't really gotten anywhere. So I think you should be drafting language.
And when I was listing the things that I thought we had tentatively come to, I forgot to mention what I understand the council's consensus that we should in fact assess a fee on the exempted units. And Colleen suggested a $300 number. And I didn't hear any objection to that. So that goes into the mix of things that we've tentatively decided. I'm not hearing any objection to that, so that goes on the list of tentative decisions. This will not be the last discussion of this topic. I thought this was.
But we got to get to the end.
Well, we've made good progress, and we've gotten good information, and I think we are making good headway. I appreciate it.
I say we got to get to the end from somebody who said we've got to have this discussion.
Okay. If there's nothing else, we're adjourned.
Oh, Dr. Barr?
Yes?
Bye. I'll call you tomorrow.